Good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, depending where you're tuning from. Everybody, we already have 21 in the house, which is a very, very good sign. And I am really excited for today's live stream. As you can see, I have a guest with me who I've been going on about. Sasha doesn't know this, but I've been going on about her for weeks now. And the fact that we're going to have this interview that I've been so excited about. I am very, very passionate about this subject, not because I'm an expert and not because it necessarily is going to provide all of the answers, but just because I feel like it's a subject that has been misinterpreted so much, and just a bit of clarity will help us in terms of understanding the role or the significance that this topic is going to play in understanding African history, global melanated history, all history. This is a very effective tool, but it has to be handled well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest. With me, I have Sasha Henriques, soon to be Dr. Sasha Henriques. She's the first Black Principal Genetic Counsellor in the UK. She's the Vice Chair of the Association of Genetic Nurses and Counsellors and convened its first subcommittee on equality, diversity and inclusion. That's EDI. She developed cross-cultural training for all genetic counsellors in the UK and runs an annual EDI workshop through St. Guy's and St. Thomas's Hospital. Her PhD research at Cambridge uses critical race theory to discuss the place of social justice in genomic research. And I want to add, we've had a couple of conversations and she's a brilliant mind. So you guys are seriously in for a treat today. So be the usual fantastic audience and community that you are. Get involved in the chat. Welcome, Sasha, to the King's Monologue. And Sasha, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good to be here. Yeah, looking forward to the chat.
And it's great to have you here. I hope you guys are tuned in. We've got 62. Make sure, please, that everyone hits up the like so that we get as many people passing in as possible. Be interactive as you always are. And yeah, we're going to have a fantastic time. Now, I first spoke to Sasha. It was, I can't remember how many weeks back. It was when I was in Rome, wasn't I? When I called you,
yeah.
Or when you called me, I can't remember. But we first spoke then, and that was a good few weeks back now. And I got your contact from Brent from the New Black. Is that what they call it? Is that the best way
New
to
Black Events, and it's called the Day After Podcast.
The Day After Podcast. That's it. And I had a fantastic time on that. By the way, guys, if you haven't seen my appearance on the Day After Podcast, please check it out and check out Sasha's, which was before mine. That was a really fun conversation. Brent, who I'm gonna forgive, had me talking politics by the end of it, and I really didn't want to talk politics. Ask these guys, I don't talk politics ever.
Okay.
But he kind of roped me into it. He's a real, he's a real sly one, but he's very good. He's really, really good at it. But I honestly, I had a fantastic time, and I did kind of make a commitment that I was going to do more kind of podcast appearances and chats. And that was like the first one, or like, well, that's the first one I've done for, might be the first one I've appeared. No, it's not the first one I've done, but it's the first one I've done for a little while. And he really whetted my appetite. And now I'm like, okay, cool. Let's do more of these, because he was I don't think everyone will be as good at audience as they were, but that was a fantastic time. Yeah. What's been your experience? Because you've done a few interviews, haven't you?
Yes.
What's been your experience on the different platforms? Give us a rundown, a bit of a
yeah, I mean it kind of depends, because I've done like really different audiences, because I guess because of what I do, but also because of what I'm interested in. So I do podcasts that are for my community when I think about like my genetic counselling community and other like Black women scientists and stuff. So I've done quite professional type podcasts kind of talking about routes into careers and those types of things, which are interesting. But then I've also done ones with like really different audiences, like Brent's podcast, where people aren't specialists in genetics, but they just kind of are really interested to hear about things. I enjoy them all because I'm a chatter. So I enjoy having conversations with people. I enjoy kind of being challenged. And my job is usually to take like the complex and make it accessible to people. So yeah, I tend to get a good response in the conversations that I have, because I try and keep it as straightforward as possible. So
you really do have that ability. I have to say, I've had a couple of conversations with you, and obviously we're going to get into the meat and bones of it soon. But I think your ability to really clearly communicate quite complex concepts when it comes to genetics is very important. And I think actually one of the reasons why that's really important is because this is a subject that people who want to misuse it often hide in obfuscation, you know, things that they know people aren't, they know the general public isn't going to be quite up to speed with this claim and that claim. So they make those claims knowing there's very unlikely there's going to be any recourse. So it's great to have someone like you. I try and do it, but I'm not qualified. But at the same time, there is the aspects, I believe, at least, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, of common sense that you can apply. You know, we kind of go, well, actually, your uniparental marker is one of several thousands, if not millions, of ancestors that you have. So you shouldn't be making such a big deal out of it. You know, that's common sense to me. You know, that's kind of like you can draw that out and do the maths, you know. So that's, but at the same time, it's great to have an expert like you on the podcast. I have to say, well, this isn't a podcast, on the channel. So a bit more background before we dive in, because I feel like once we get going, there's going to be no stopping. Can you give us a little bit about your background if you're happy to? Go on.
Okay, so we were talking a little bit about this earlier, weren't we, when we were seeing if cameras work. So I'm from East London, born and raised in London, grew up mostly in East London, to a Rastafarian mother in Newham, if anybody knows it. So I kind of grew up with lots of Africa in my house, African perspectives in my house, but also lots of support for us to be whatever we want to be. And so I have two sisters, and one works in construction. And as you know, that's not very usual for a Black woman to be a senior person in construction. I have one sister who's a software engineer, and I have always loved science. So I kind of started off wanting to do science and actually wanting to be a science journalist for a long time. And so my training up until that point was kind of science communication and things. And then I came to genetic counselling kind of a little bit later. So I trained in genetic counselling quite late on in my career, around kind of my 30s, and then lived in Manchester for many years. I've practiced genetic counselling in Manchester, in South Africa, and then I moved back to the UK, eventually ending up in London at Guy's and St Thomas's, practicing genetic counselling there. And so I have worked in genetic counselling for a long time, and then recently started kind of research like through the PhD route. So that's kind of using different techniques than I used kind of in the clinic, thinking more about the study of kind of people and systems and stuff. So I think that's a good start. I don't know if people know what a genetic counsellor is. People do increasingly these days, but not everybody does. Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to be honest. I didn't know what a genetic counsellor was until I heard about you, and then I researched what it was. And I think it's quite interesting. You mentioned that you were the first Black genetic counsellor. But now there's more. Just give us a little bit about that and kind of the impact you've made there.
Sure. So I think the experience of being a Black person in the UK in further and higher education is that it's not infrequent that you're the only person in the room. So a lot of people will kind of share that experience. And so I think I had that in many different ways, and probably, you know, it's almost like you come to kind of expect it. And so when I moved into genetic counselling, so genetic counselling is a healthcare scientist. So my job essentially is working with patients who are affected by genetic diseases or hereditary diseases. And I'm the person that kind of draws family trees, decides what genetic tests they have, talks to them about the results, but also takes care of their like psychosocial needs. So, you know, how that result has impacted them and their family or their family to be or their family planning, that type of thing. So it's a pretty niche job. So again, it's not a huge workforce. Being the only in the room is probably what you expect in such, you know, it's not like being a nurse or being a doctor where there are like so many of you. So I think I kind of just didn't notice for a long time. I was always really interested in how this job that I thought was brilliant, like this amalgamation of the passion of science, but also the passion of helping people to access information that can make a difference in their life and looking after them in that process. Like for me, it was the most ideal job ever. But I was just really struck by, I'm doing this job and actually the clinics are in places where the population is quite mixed, but actually who I see in the clinic isn't always, you know, the way that I would expect it to be given the population. I don't see that many Black patients coming through. The way that people dealt with sickle cell compared to other genetic conditions, even though sickle cell is a genetic condition, was different. So there were these kind of big kind of differences that I was seeing. Also, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, the information that people got from genetic tests was different based on where in the world they were from. So people who were from Asian and African and indigenous populations often got less clear results from genetic testing, that type of stuff. So I was kind of always really trying to figure out like what is this that's going on? And then I went to go and work in South Africa because I wanted to meet genetic counselors who were Black, because it was very clear that after 5 years in, I was not meeting another one in any conference, in anything. And also a patient group that was Black as well, to see like what kind of skills could I learn about counselling Black and African patients, and also about working with Black and African colleagues. And when I got to South Africa, there were no Black genetic counsellors there either. Wow. And so I mean, genetic counselling.
I mean, that's wild. Very quickly. I mean, you went to South Africa. Sorry, people, can we just fathom that? She went to South Africa. This is a country whose population is 90. Is it 90% Black?
Over late 80s, 80-ish, late 80s.
80. It used to be 80. I thought it had gone up. But okay, so late 80s% Black, and you were the first Black genetic counsellor. That's one of the big problems about South Africa that I'm not going to go into right now. Yeah. This is one of the big problems, and I find this across every industry in South Africa, is that the layers of power and expertise are still greatly weighted towards the non-Indigenous population. And that's a problem. It needs to be addressed, but that's political. We're not going to go into that right now. Sorry, that's a wild statistic. Sorry, go ahead, carry on.
No problem. And so, that feeling of, okay, I was the only in the room because I'm in a minoritized group in a niche profession in the UK, and then I go somewhere else and I'm like, okay, you have, we globally have these same anti-Blackness issues, and they have made a difference to the way that society is structured and education is structured, and it's still kind of causing a problem here. And then I kind of looked at like American statistics and the workforce in America. They were like, it's only 2% Black workforce in genetics in America. So actually this idea of being quite rare in genetics, as in genetic medicine, as a Black person, you realize like it's a pretty global thing to do with all sorts of things, politics and isms and all sorts of things. So I think for me that trip to South Africa was very much like cemented kind of these three strands of what my career is about. And it's about, as you said, I'm not going to finish being the only Black genetic counsellor in the UK, and we have 6 more in that time. That's
a big improvement. So
yeah, it's a big improvement, and we all know each other and we all support each other. So that's also different than how I came through. So there's the workforce, but also what it really opened my eyes to was that if you have a workforce that isn't, is quite homogenous, it's just one thing, lots of white middle class women, how are they meeting the needs of patients that are not that? And so that's where kind of that training about cultural communication skills came in. Because with such a huge gap, we're not going to characteristically match clinicians with patients, but that means the clinicians need a whole nother level of skill to think about how culture, when you're thinking about how someone's been affected by something, comes into that whole situation. So there was that. And then the last bit, which is, I think, related to where I can maybe help with some of the discussions about the things that you are thinking about, is what about the data? So what does it mean about, what type of data we have, how we make groups in that data, how that data can embed inequity, how it can further understanding. So those were kind of the three things that I was interested in, because the data also is overwhelmingly European data, and that has an impact on the work that we do clinically, but also in lots of other ways in terms of what we use genetics for. And, these are some of the things we'll probably talk about.
Yeah. I mean, you touched on a couple of important points there. So the first thing is going back to your role as a genetic counselor.
Sure.
What I understood is that the most important thing is that a genetic counselor has to understand what they're looking at and then be able to communicate that understanding. So essentially, you're probably one of the most important people when it comes to interpreting genetic data, I would say. Is that a fair assumption to make?
Yeah, for the person who's having the test, absolutely. Because I guess, so in a genetics department, for instance, like we work in hospitals often, there are lots of different settings that we work in now. But you have the people who work in the laboratory, so the wet lab people who are dealing with the actual physical kind of DNA. And then you have kind of the computational kind of dry lab people. So the people who take that information and work out what that information means and try to interpret that information. You have the genetic doctors who are thinking, what diagnosis could be made.
Yeah.
And then you have the genetic counselors, which piece that all together for a patient. And then the patient can take that information and be like, okay, well, this is what I want to do in my next pregnancy, or this is how I want to communicate with my family, because everyone speaks their different languages, really. So, what I speak to patients is not what scientists speak to each other. And so it's about bridging those gaps.
That's amazing. Can I just give a shout out to Day After in the chat? I'm not sure if that's Brent but hello, they're in the chat. So shout out to, I was besmirching your name earlier. Said you're very smooth, you're very slick with the way that you're talking about politics. But yeah, it's really good to have you, man. So the other thing that you touched on that I wanted to kind of zoom on a little bit was when you spoke about the fact that people of African or Asian ethnic minorities, I'm going to say in inverted commas,
global majority,
global majority ethnic minorities tend to have substandard, would you say substandard, not as good, not as thorough as the data that comes out of Europe, because so much more testing goes on amongst Europeans, so they've got much more rich data. Is that essentially what you were getting at? Or
okay, we can I don't know if I would use, I mean, sometimes it can be that stark, sometimes it's not as sensational as that, because the thing that you have to remember is that as human beings, most of our DNA is the same, right? So we're talking about 99% of what we have is the same amongst all of us. We're one species, so it's kind of the same. So a lot of
I've heard 99.9. Sorry to cut you off. Is that right, or is that correct?
Yeah.
So it's 99.9.
That's okay. What so that's what the Human Genome Project kind of came up with once it kind of referenced people, and we haven't really moved from that. What's in that bit that's not the same is crucial. So don't get me wrong. That's not to say that there isn't important information in what's not the same. But what that means is lots of common diseases, common things amongst human beings. The tests and the results will generally be the same. Where you see the biggest difference is in that kind of tiny little space of what is different. And that tends to be where rare conditions are. And so as a genetic counselor, I don't see common kind of conditions like diabetes or asthma or those types of genetic conditions that are caused by lots of environment and lots of different genes. I see very specific and often very rare conditions. So in that space, because most of the databases and references that we use are on populations that are described as kind of European ancestry populations. And I mean huge differences. So we're talking about, and it hasn't got better kind of over the last few years. We're talking over 90% of the databases that we use generally in kind of lots of testing in genetics labs are European. And so what that means is you don't have a reference point for the populations that are not from them. And so when you do genetic testing, and you get a result, we kind of grade that result about whether it's pathogenic or whether it's benign. So a change in your genes is normal. Everybody has changes in your genes. It what makes some people's eyes blue and some people's eyes brown. And sometimes when it causes a problem, we call that change a mutation. But a change is a change.
Okay, so let me just get a definition there, not to cut you off, because that's
no problem.
I've always assumed that any change is classified as a mutation. A mutation, you're saying, is it's only classified a mutation when it's negative.
In the way that we talk about it, I guess in the genetic clinic, often when we're talking about a mutation, we're talking about something that's different than the reference point.
Okay.
Yeah. And so sometimes you can have, yes, negative mutations and positive mutations, but we don't tend, as a genetics clinician, I don't tend to use the word mutation because it is only associated with a negative, like it has a negative connotation. So I often use words like change or glitch or just to signify that kind of colloquial way that mutation is associated with something wrong is actually not what we mean when there's a change. And so those changes, as I said, can be labeled as a pathogenic change or a benign change. So it doesn't mean that there isn't a change there, but it just doesn't cause a problem, or it does cause a problem. And for populations that have less data in the references, it's harder to make the interpretation about whether the change that you see falls in pathogenic or falls in benign, or where it falls kind of on that scale, because all of that is kind of interpretation based on all the other tests that you've done and all the other bits of information. So I, in my practice, had noticed, and there are papers and things that describe this, that for those populations that aren't heavily weighted in the data sets, they tend to get what we call variants of uncertain significance. So they have a higher incident of these VUSs. And so imagine if there's a condition in your family and you want to know the genetic cause, and you do a genetic test, and I come up with this variant of uncertain significance because we don't have enough data to classify it. That's really hard because we can't make any medical actions on that information. You don't know whether to pass that on to your family or not. It might mean something that we have to retest. And sometimes when we look at kind of risk scores, they are only what we call polygenic risk scores, where we look at lots of small bits of DNA that work together to give you a risk, particularly of things like cancer. Those are only useful in the populations that they're done in. So again, because if the population sets are kind of overwhelming European, we find that those type of scores don't translate very well to kind of different population groups.
So a quick question on that VUS thing. Sorry, and we're not going to stay too long on this because I want to get you into my world in a second. But it kind of sparked my interest because you mentioned those variants of was it
uncertain significance? VUS, we call it. Yeah.
So in my mind, everybody kind of like is probably popping up. Every individual kind of pops up some kind of a change or mutation in their genome. So when it comes, is that right or wrong? And so when it comes to these VUSs, is it a case of you've got an inkling that is linked to something, or something different has just turned up and instantly it's alarm bells because there's a change in the genome?
No, your genes change all the time. So this kind of shuffling around of genes and changing of genes has a purpose for us as a species. So it can make us better adapted to particular things. It can mean that certain traits are passed on or not. It can give us resistance to certain things. So genes changing over generations is quite a normal thing to happen. Most of those changes, as I said, are kind of, we say benign changes, but changes that don't cause a problem. So yes, everybody's genome has these changes kind of all the time. when we're talking about like a genetic test, you've already come with a problem. So we don't just randomly test people in a genetic clinic. You've already come with a problem, a health problem that somebody has referred you for. And we know kind of the region where we should be looking for some genetic change that could be linked to that problem. So I spent lots of years looking at kind of cardiac conditions, so heart conditions that were passed on in families. And so there are particular genes that are associated with particular conditions. And so we would have been testing a particular set of genes rather than all of your whole kind of genome. And so we're looking for a change in a particular gene, but that change that comes back is kind of a VUS. In terms of like serious...
So you already know that the gene is linked to something.
Yes.
So it's a targeted search.
So we can have there are different types of tests. So we can have tests that are particularly targeted at a particular gene or a group of genes, because you absolutely know that the answer is more than likely going to be there. And so you don't have to do a big search of all the genome. Or it might be quicker if you don't know where to look, or you've already done a number of tests to actually look at somebody's whole genome. And that's become kind of very quick now. So there are lots of different instances in just NHS routine care where people can kind of have their whole genome sequenced.
Okay, brilliant. So I've just put a comment on the screen because I was about to laugh as you were speaking. So Factin, seriously. So I went to a geneticist for a heart condition. She only told me I have a V-shaped head.
Oh dear. Yeah, I don't know who that was. That's not how I talk to patients. So I mean,
man, that's hilarious.
It could. All right. So there are some genetic.
Is that dolichocephaly, surfactant?
There are some genetic conditions that are related to the size of your head and the shape of your head. So I don't know. Without seeing your head, I don't know what I want to say about that.
Oh dear. All right, let's all right, so let's jump in. All right, so I'm gonna ask you a question, and I'm gonna let you just flow with it. Okay, so it's very broad and it's very open. My first question to you is, what's more important, genealogy or genetics? And I know that's broad and loaded, but I'm going to throw that your way.
It's not broad and loaded, because I think there are a lot of... I was at a meeting the other day and there was a geneticist right next to me, and he, in fact, also said, as a geneticist, I probably shouldn't say that I don't think genetics is always the answer. And so for me, it's really easy to say that you need all of those things together. Because as a genetic counselor, that's what I do. I think about kind of the genetics, but I also think about your family story. I think about where you're from. When I take a family history, I ask all sorts of questions. Like, we're not just, who was adopted, who was the secret child in the family. Like, there were all sorts of other models of ancestry and hereditary, like who we call family and who's in the family. And a genetic test can't tell you all of those things. And also genetics just can't tell you much more than kind of what's happened in recent history. And so sometimes you need the genealogy to kind of go along with that, so that you can get a fuller picture actually about kind of migration and all of those sorts of things as well. So I would say that they both go together, but they both have their limitations. And so that's what's important to remember, is that there are limitations of both of those things. Yeah.
Okay. Great answer. I guess that leads me to another question now. So when it comes to ancestry testing, and I think a lot of this is going to be linked with ancestry testing or the use of genetics in anthropology, like we spoke about.
Sure.
When it comes to ancestry testing, let me ask you the first question. What exactly are people getting in their ancestry results? Are you able to explain what they're normally getting? You feel you've done a 23andMe. What do you get back from them?
Okay, so if you did a test like 23andMe, it is looking to match parts of your DNA with other populations and tell you how likely you are either to be related to kind of your close relatives or kind of what ethnic group you might belong to. But all of that is done based on the algorithm that they use to match what they've found to the references that they have in the database.
Okay.
I don't know if that's
I'm going to dig in further. So,
answer. Yeah.
No, it's a great answer. So, correct me if I'm wrong. So, from my understanding,
yeah,
you have, well, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, you have 3 types of DNA that tend to be
Sure.
used in
Okay.
these kind of ancestry or anthropological tests. So you have your
Yeah.
uniparental markers, which are Y DNA, which is your
Mhm.
paternal lineage,
Yeah.
along a single line. I think
Mhm.
you'll definitely jump in there. Your mitochondrial DNA, which is your maternal lineage,
Okay.
along a maternal line, single line once again. And
Mhm.
then you have autosomal DNA, which
Yeah.
is your entire genome, but
Okay.
it doesn't reach back very far, I'm told, in terms of autosomal DNA. You don't get deep reaching DNA,
Yeah.
I'm told. So that's normally what's used to find your relatives.
Okay.
Is that
Yes.
correct? And then
Yeah.
your single line DNA,
Okay.
I've heard geneticists say they're essentially party tricks, but
Okay.
I
So,
don't know if you want to build up on that and give us a bit of
okay,
a,
so maybe if
yeah, of
I start the other way around, because as a
course.
genetic counselor, I build up the other way around. So if I start the other way around with the description of what genes are and where DNA is, then that might kind of help a bit more. So you
Perfect.
know that like the DNA is the code that's everything about you, and the DNA that is the code that's everything about you is packaged on a structure called a chromosome. You have 22 chromosomes, 23 chromosomes. The last pair of those chromosomes are the things that make you XY man or XX woman. So the 22 chromosomes that are not the X and the Y are your autosome. And the autosome, what happens to that is, well, what happens to all of your DNA anyway, when you pass them on, is that they kind of shuffle around and they get passed on. So your autosome has a lot of this kind of recombinance, this shuffling around before it gets passed on. Out of your 22 pairs, that Y chromosome is the thing that makes you a man. So in order for a child to be a man has to pass on his Y chromosome in his sperm, and then that's the one that turns the baby into a man. So the Y chromosome goes from man to man to man to man to man. So it doesn't have this reshuffling, recombinant stuff. So you can chase it all the way back, right? Because it pretty much doesn't change down that line. Whereas your autosome does, which is why it's kind of hard to trace it back, because it's doing all of this shuffling kind of all the time. And your DNA is packaged, so you've got your cell, and in the nucleus of your cell is where those 23 chromosomes kind of live. 23 pairs of chromosomes live in the nucleus of the cell. So sometimes they call that the nuclear chromosomes, the nuclear DNA. But what powers the cells is this energy piece of machinery called the mitochondria. And so in an egg that goes to make a baby, the mitochondria in, just like an egg with a yolk, the mitochondria are like in the white bit of the egg. And when a sperm fertilizes the egg, it loses the tail with the machinery, and it's just the nuclear DNA that goes. So the egg has this mitochondrial DNA. And so every time a woman produces an egg, you get mitochondrial DNA. And for all of her children, she passes on mitochondrial DNA. So again, it doesn't have so much of this kind of recombination effect. It's just passed on. And so you can trace the mitochondrial DNA from mother to offspring, from mother to offspring, but along the female line. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. So
Okay.
here's a very logical question that I'm going to
Yeah.
lead from the back of that now. So in
Sure.
terms of both your Y DNA and
Mm-hmm.
your mitochondrial DNA, we
Mm-hmm.
essentially know, or at least
Mm-hmm.
I think we're pretty certain, that we all come from a single pair of ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
somewhere down the line in Adam and Eve. Okay,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
why is it that people have different markers in their Y DNA or their mitochondrial DNA? What's happened between the original to where we are now?
Yeah. So there are splits of those they call them haplotypes, like these groups, these different groups of genetic information that kind of gets passed on. And so there kind of are splits of those. So you can kind of think of that like a tree, because as I said, like a mother might pass her mitochondria on to this offspring, but actually when the DNA splits, that mitochondria doesn't get passed on the paternal line, and they kind of recombinate that way. So they kind of split after every generation. But if you trace them all back, there's like just a line that everybody kind of, like a tree, and everybody's branch kind of goes closer and closer and closer to this single kind of Y and mitochondrial DNA. So that's where those splits happen. Is that the question that you're asking me?
Sort of, but I mean, I guess I got from your first statement that the Y DNA doesn't change because it comes directly from your, but somewhere down the line, the Y DNA has changed in order for people to have different Y DNA. So is that a mutation that's taking place? Okay.
Yeah. So I said
is that the same as recombination, or
don't change, but there are points in history where those things happen, and then there will be a split.
Superb. Okay, brilliant. That's what I want to get to. All right, so you have these changes that occur. Fantastic. And then so going to the autosome.
Yes.
That's your whole genome. Yeah.
The 20 is the 22. The 22.
Right, okay.
Not including your X and your Y. Yeah.
And why will you need to use that to find ancestors as opposed to?
Yeah, because if you think about me, just my family as a person. No, maybe let's take you, because I don't have a Y. So if we took you as a person, we know that by looking at your Y, we know who your dad is. And
you're gonna have to explain to everyone why you don't have a Y and I do.
Okay, so
just really quickly, sorry, before you go on.
As biologically female, I have 2 X chromosomes. So in my cells, all the cells in my body, as far as I know, because I've never tested, and genes do very weird and wonderful things, even though I might look like this. As far as I know, we're assuming that in my cells, there are 2 X's in all of them. And so I'm a woman, and when I go to have children and I produce eggs,
fine girl, no pimple. Come on.
Each of my eggs, half of my DNA, I will only ever give an X chromosome, because my pair of sex chromosomes are both X's, whereas your pair of sex chromosomes are an X and a Y.
Brilliant. So that means men inherit both mitochondrial and Y DNA.
Everybody inherits mitochondrial, but you also get this Y DNA as well.
Well, we don't pass on mitochondrial, we only pass on Y.
But you only pass on your Y. Yeah.
Yeah.
So going backwards from you, if we looked at your Y, it would tell us where you got your Y from, which is your dad, and your mitochondrial, which is your mum. But that means it doesn't tell us about your mum's dad, and it doesn't tell us about your dad's mum. And so we can keep going back to those, through those generations, but we're only ever finding about the father of the father of the father of the father, and the mother of the mother and the mother of the mother. And so I like to think of it like an inverted triangle, that you're kind of here in the middle, and that genetic test is taking you on a line down here, but all in the middle are people who you are related to, but we have no way of finding them because we're only testing Ys and mitochondrial DNA along the edge. So that's one way that originally they started doing genetic testing. They were just looking at Y lineage and X lineage, which can go back really, really far, but doesn't tell you about all this family in the middle.
I've actually got a really cool diagram that I did to demonstrate that when I did a genetics live stream a little while back. I'm trying to find it. If I can't find it, I'm just going to skip ahead. Yeah, but it would be nice to show you that. I just want you to go, oh, that's good, because I need your approval now. That's what I'm after. More than anything. I can't find it at the moment. I will find it. Big shout out to Yashwa Almari for the £5 donation. Thank you very much.
No, he can't pass on the X.
Have you read his comment already? It says,
I know what the question was it mitochondrial or X chromosome?
Are you answering me or?
Oh, there were conversations in the chat. I don't know. I missed it.
Okay. Sorry, no, that was just... sorry. I wondered. All right, so I'm just going to quick shout out to Yashua, who said, "I know 2 diasporans who got Moroccan and Spanish citizenship after doing a 3GD match. Can you ask who you talking to? Can you hear someone?
No.
Okay. Sorry. I thought were you responding to me? Okay, sorry, there's a delay. There's a wild delay right now that's really confusing me. Sorry. I'm losing the plot here. Okay. Spanish citizenship, after doing a 3GD GED match test, can you ask if it's worth doing or if it's accurate?
Accuracy diminishes the further back you go. and depending on who did the test. So I can't really comment on the accuracy of the test if I don't know who did the test and what kind of databases they use to do the test. But generally speaking, if we're talking about immediate relatives, so trying to find relatives who in kind of less than 4 generations, I think it is, then actually that the ancestry test is really accurate for that. So it's really accurate for finding your close relatives. But once we start getting, quite far, those numbers change exponentially, because if you think about it, you have 4 grandparents, and then that doubles with the next generation, and all the relatives in between. So I think like by the time you get to 25 generations, we're talking about like millions of relatives. And I think they say that even if your relatives, there were only 3 children in every generation, you would have about 20,000 eight cousins, like so so it depends how recent you need the history. If it's very recent history and relatives, then absolutely it's generally quite accurate. After that, we're actually just doing probability and statistics.
Okay, so if I take a genetic test and it comes back and it tells me I'm 85% Nigerian and 15% African American, for instance, what is it? What is it telling me? What exactly am I? Actually, it will never tell me I'm African American because they're not represented at all. They just call them Nigerians. But anyway, that's another discussion. What exactly is that test telling me?
What exactly is that test telling you? Okay, I'm trying to think about how layered this conversation needs to be. So, the first thing that it's telling you is it's not a measurement, like a quantitative analysis of actually like what you're made up of. It's a statistical representation of who you are matched to. So it's essentially saying that 85% of the DNA markers that they looked at were matched with people from a particular region now in recent history.
Okay, that's very interesting. So it's not a percentage of, it's not basically saying basically if it said it's not saying I'm 85%. By the way, I haven't done my test, by the way, if anyone's wondering. and I don't intend to but it's not saying I'm 85% Nigerian and I'm 15% American. It's saying 85% of my genome matches people who are currently in the region of Nigeria, and 15% of my genome matches people who are currently in America. That's what it's telling me.
Yeah. And they're using a probability score to kind of do that. So it's basically it's probably. And so different ancestry companies will use different algorithms to make that calculation, and different ways that they have, I guess, grouped the markers into different populations. And so that test might have a slightly different result somewhere else, not because your DNA has changed, because your DNA can't change, but because the way they look at the information, the way they do the probability match, and the way they have made the groups might differ slightly.
Got it. So how effective, in your view, is ancestry tests as a tool for understanding history, or for at least, can I make the claim that if my test results come up as this, that therefore I'm historically part of that region?
So 2 things. Oh, there's one thing I left out, which touched on the original thing about the databases and who's in the databases. So because you're doing a genetic similarity kind of test, you obviously need people who are similar to you in the references. So you need them in the database. And so one of the other places of error that can come into doing ancestry tests is that the people they need you to match with, the people who you are most similar with, might not exist in the database, because those databases also are not completely diverse enough in how much of the human population is in those databases. So we know that that's also another reason why it might not be accurate and why they don't change. So that was that. What's the other question you asked me?
So I'm going to just dive into that really quickly because that's really interesting. Okay. Sorry. So essentially, if you're from a population and you're the first from that population to test, what kind of results might you get? Or that you're quite early on in terms of their database, they've never seen what your genome's throwing up before.
Yeah, it might be quite vague and quite broad. So it might give like quite a broad area, like I mean, it's a bit dramatic, but you know, like maybe just saying sub-Saharan Africa or something, like it might be quite broad. It might be that there's a part of your genome that they just don't match. So this is the other thing about kind of making groups, is if you don't reach the right score to make that a probability match, sometimes that's just ignored because there's not enough information to say that that's an accurate enough result. So there might be things that just don't appear on your ancestry test because there aren't enough people in there to do that test for you. So you'll find that populations like that have been tested a lot, like European populations, that granularity might be there a bit more. So they might have a lot more detail about these different places than perhaps if you did a test of African populations, because there are not as many populations in the databases, but also African populations have a huge amount of diversity. And so it's a very simplified picture that we often get when we're matched to ethnicity populations in Africa. Other question that you asked me, I think I know the answer, but I can't remember the question. It was something about using modern borders, modern ideas of population. So again, when we're getting that information, we're looking at where people are now, and what an ancestry test doesn't tell you, as I said, with all those other bits of information that might help us make sense of actually where you're from, because it doesn't tell us about how groups of people have migrated or moved, how those groups used to live together, how they used to name each other. So these are using recent mapping of human populations that might not necessarily be the same as kind of more and ancient kind of forms of population mapping. So that's the other reason that it's not accurate, I guess, in that way, to lay claim to a particular landmass because the people who you are related to happen to be there at that time, because there's a whole bit of the story that we just don't get from the genetic testing.
No, that's brilliant. And I guess what I'm hearing there, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that because I'm pretty sure there are some ancestry DNA collection, what do they call themselves, testing agencies or whatever, that do make historical claims. They'll say things like, oh, you're related to this pharaoh, or they'll say things like, I've seen that quite a lot, or they'll say things like, you know, historically this means your people went from here to So what I'm hearing there is that the field of, or at least this field of genetic or ancestry testing is reliant on anthropology. It's reliant on being given some kind of a narrative in order to give feedback to people, because they haven't tested these people historically, have they? They haven't got large databases of people from
we don't have large databases of ancient DNA, so we can never be accurate. So
they're wholly reliant on the version of history that they've been handed, essentially. Is that correct? Or
I don't know. I'm processing what that question means. So
are they sitting down? Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I don't know if I would give anthropology the credit for all of that.
Okay. Yeah.
I think I would say just much more broadly, as a society, we have constructed ways of thinking about populations and people and races. And there is a blurred line between thinking about geography, ethnicity, race, and nationality. Like all of those lines are kind of complex and inconsistent and blurred. And I don't think that we have any discipline that does a very clean and accurate job of placing us into, because we just as a species, we aren't neatly in these boxes. So at some point we created these kind of boxes around us, and we try to put people in these boxes, and that's never going to be an exact science. So you're right that everything that we do, therefore, that uses this model of people can be neatly 25, 75 and 25% this, relies on a concept of these boxes that had been invented, which are largely kind of continental. And again, as I said, this continental way that we think of the world now, and that's how we map people out. Does that make sense? Have I lost you?
No, I think my PC is hanging a little bit. It's struggling for some reason. I really wish it wouldn't. So, Karen, could you just repeat that last statement that you made? Sorry about that.
Can I repeat it? So I think
no, just the last sentence. Just the last sentence. So sorry, not the whole thing.
You asked me, was anthropology kind of responsible for making these categorizations? I think is the word that I used, and I was essentially just saying that society as a whole has very incomplete and inconsistent ways of making these boxes, and the ancestry test or any discipline relies on these categories that have already been set down in lots of different ways. And yes, anthropology kind of has been part of that, but we all use that in lots of different ways. And so it's almost like the ancestry tests don't have any other language to describe populations, because that's just the way that we think about populations in these kind of continental ways and tribal ways that are recent ways that people exist, but we actually don't know anything about the ancient groups.
Exactly. And I think even the idea of, people do have this idea, and we touched on this earlier when it was just me and you chatting, but people do have this kind of idea of, be it, tribal or racial, but this idea of kind of like purity, this kind of world where people didn't mix. I've heard people say, oh yeah, I got my DNA tested and I trace back to the to the Nguni tribe of South Africa. And I'm like, dude, like, you're like 500 years removed. You're probably everything, let's be real. Like, you've probably got loads of everything in you, particularly if you're of the diaspora, it's very unlikely that all of your ancestors. I mean, if you go back, what is it, 600 years? Is that like it's a million, is it? Your ancestors you have? So they're not all gonna be from one tribe. It's very unlikely. You'll be lucky even if 50% of them are from there. It's probably likely you're just a massive conglomerate mix of loads of different groupings, languages, ethnographies, whatever you want to call it, of people that has created you. So where are people getting this idea that they can trace back which tribe they're from? Where's that coming from? Because I always find that quite puzzling when people want to trace back exactly what tribe they come. What do they mean, and where are they getting that from?
Yeah, so I think there's a few ways of thinking about that. One is, I guess, thinking about people who are diasporans and removed from maybe kind of oral and written histories about who they are, means that people are able to market to the sense of belonging. And so they are very cleverly designed these tests to give the impression that they can give you these types of answers. I think also we have to accept that all of us are affected by the idea that there's some type of purity in race and lines. And so I think everybody is kind of affected by that. Like I hear my community using that type of language about the things that make us African and the things that make us Black. And actually, when you think about the human DNA and who we are, like, it's fuzzy and it's mixed, and people have traveled and people have moved, even within kind of Africa itself. So I think, and because we don't have any way of measuring that, all we're ever talking about is probability matching two groups, that it's just not accurate to kind of put us in those boxes. It's just a representation of that. And as you said, which was the other thing that I wanted to pick up, it's not to say that we can't find these ancient markers, or we can't find these Y lineages that go very deeply, or we can't find the facts that so-and-so might be a relative. It's just the fact that the human species is so related to each other that by the time you get to those levels, you're talking about you and 20,000 people also being related to that person, or you and 33 million people also being, somehow related to this ancestor from this place. So it's not, accurate and inaccurate are kind of really difficult words, because it's basically you've decided to construct the world in a particular way and then design a test that gives answers based on the way that you've constructed the world.
Yeah. That's a very good answer. I just want to give a quick read out to Surfactant's message, because he gave a $5 donation. He said, so those algorithms / data sets can be manipulated or changed based on whoever controls it.
Bingo.
Okay, I guess a yes from you. I didn't want to answer that question, so thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So my PhD research is around social justice in genomic research. And the reason that that's the question is because what's in the database and the tools that you use to decide how you chop the database up and think about who goes where, these are the statistical tools that somebody chooses to use. And people do that in all sorts of different ways. They change the parameters of what makes you in a group or not. They decide whether you are mixed between certain populations and they can deal with that mixture or not deal with that mixture. So these are all, somebody has to make a decision about those things. These aren't exact sciences in that way.
I agree. I'm going to share a screen quickly because I found my diagram. So I just want to show it to you, and you're allowed to obviously debunk this if any of it is incorrect. So this is what I drew up. I did this a little while ago.
Okay.
And tell me if it's accurate. So you've got an individual over here, and this is the blue line is his Y ancestry. So that's his dad and his dad's dad, and so on. And the pink line, I know that I was very generic there with the colors, is his female ancestry or his mitochondrial ancestry. So he's got his mum there and his mum's mum and mum and so on. And then all in the middle here, just I think like you were saying earlier, are all of his other contributors to his genome who aren't picked up in either of these testing lines.
Right.
And there was a couple of points I was making here. The first one is that you don't have to go back very far, only 7 generations to have loads of people.
Right.
I mean, it took 7 generations, that's like 150 years or so. And we're looking at, 128 people. And then it goes up exponentially from there, like literally.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So loads of people contribute to your genome. And also the other thing I want to mention is that people make such a big deal about their Y DNA or their mitochondrial DNA lineage. Whereas let's say your Y DNA comes up, I'm just going to make up a name, your XXX lineage or something like that, along your Y DNA. Now, someone else could have someone with that exact lineage, but in the middle somewhere, so it's not being picked up. But you both have exactly the same contribution of that lineage. It's just that you see it and he doesn't. Is that fair to say? So it's like that contribution it's not special in any way, shape, or form. It's just preserved. Is that correct in terms of what it contributes to your genome?
So yes, there will be people who might be related to some of those people who are not showing up. I think that's what you mean. But there will be people outside of your diagram whose Y lineage also traces back to possibly one of the people in your diagram. So this is just looking at you, and and because there are so many relatives, there will be all sorts of ways that people do trace back. So when, as I said, like when people, the further back you go, in terms of where your lineage or your haplotype kind of ends, there will be lots of branches that actually go up to there who may not be in your ancestry table. But also what this means in terms of the genetic contribution to you, there are a lot of relatives here, but you halve your genes every time you pass them on. So every time a parent makes a child, they divide the genetic contribution in half, and then they divide it in half again, and then they divide it in half again. So you may also have relatives here that have no genetic contribution to you. So there's no DNA that you have that has come from those people, even though they are your ancestors. So there is that as well.
And this is where it comes back to, I guess, to my first question that I asked you, which was what's more important, genealogy or genetics? Because how important is it that someone's passed information onto you? Because I'm told you could lose an ancestor in as little as is it 3 generations, and an ancestor can be completely lost. They're still your ancestor. It doesn't matter if you've got that little bit of information in you. That person is still your ancestor. It doesn't make it so. In that sense, in my mind, I'm thinking, well, what's more important is that you know that that person is your ancestor. You've got that kind of like, well, you know, link to that, I don't know, people or that society or that culture. That kind of trumps whether or not you're carrying the genetic info, because by random chance you could lose a whole chunk of really vital, you know, ancestral information if you don't understand or if you're not connected to your genealogy. Is that fair to say?
And so the question is not what is more important, it's what is more important for the question that you're asking.
Yes, of course.
So for instance, because we operate in this way that we pass on genetic information, we also pass on those traits that cause disease. And so for me, if I'm doing a genetic test and I find one of these variants of uncertain significance, for instance, and I didn't know which population the person was from, that variant might be benign in one population, but pathogenic in another population. And if I don't have the information about where the person is from, if I didn't look at the DNA in that way to kind of figure out generally how similar it is to a certain group of people, I wouldn't be able to make that assessment about whether this piece of genetic information is useful or not useful. So sometimes, depending on the question that you need to ask, absolutely, you are going to need some of this kind of ancestry information or population information. If the question is, so like in my family, we have stories handed down about where we're from, you know, where people migrated from, who so-and-so looked like, those types of things. Would I want to throw all of that information out, all of that family story out, because I did this genetic test, which is as a movable feast as I've described it, and it doesn't show that thing, right? So I read an article recently where somebody felt that they had some type of Indian, Asian or Indian lineage, they were Caribbean, and when they did the test the first time, it wasn't there. And then when they did the test later on, then it kind of turned up. So there were those types of things where, as a genetic counsellor, when I think about the fact that somebody is doing the test for belonging and for understanding who they are, just taking the genetic information is kind of a dangerous thing to do, because actually I feel like, you know, who you are as a person, who you are as a group, who you are as a culture relies on all of that information, and we shouldn't be weighting one bit of information higher than the other. We still need to do those other things. We still need those oral histories. We still need the storytelling. We still need all of those things to create a more accurate picture of actually who we are and where we've come from.
I totally concur with that. It reminds me, and people know in this chat, I say one of the biggest things that we actually do in the Black community, I say Black community, but yeah, I'm going to say Black community in this case. I think this is something that we see unanimously. I think particularly over the past maybe 2 or 3 generations, is we don't give enough respect to the words of our elders. Yes. I feel like the education system played a big role in us discrediting our history that was given orally, you know, the things that we are told about our past. A example that I can give you that always comes to my mind is Tina Turner. Her grandmother, I think, was supposed to be Native American. I can't remember if it was Cherokee or exactly what it was, but she's got pictures of her grandmother who was full regalia, proper, you know, native, knew all the rituals and everything. She had a DNA test, her DNA taken, and I remember it was Skip Gates, who I'm going to withhold my opinion about right now because you'll probably meet him soon. And he gave her back her feedback, and he was like, yeah, you don't have any Native American DNA. You're fully Nigerian. Da, da, da. And I remember watching this because it angered me, you know, unspeakably. This was a long time ago, by the way. This is maybe 10, 15 years ago. So you can imagine they might even be different now. But it was just this kind of like this act that this DNA results are so definitive. Your grandma was a kook. That's basically what he was going back and saying. She was crazy. You know, a lot of people were in denial about where they were from because X, Y, and Z. And it's like, no, her grandmother was probably exactly what she said she was. Your DNA test can't just literally disprove that. You've done nothing to investigate what the roots of China. You have no idea whether or not a group of Nigerians sailed in at, you know, 1000 BC and settled in that very colony that she's talking about. You have no idea. You're just literally gonna say that this woman's crazy because, you know what I mean, you've done a DNA test.
So there's two things that makes me think of, which when I talk about kind of how the language of genetics is kind of very it's very Western and Eurocentric in its thinking, and that these concepts of hereditary and genes are something that other cultures kind of don't have. And so there's a distinction, and none of these are more important or less important, but there are the two things. So one is absolutely she may have relatives, biological relatives in her lineage that were, and it's just not showing up in the way that you've decided to draw the lines, right? So there is that. But then the other thing is that different cultures have different ways of thinking about lineage and hereditary. And so, you know, you could become a Roman. You can become do you know what I mean? Like Native American tribes, you can become part of a tribe in all sorts of different ways. And they then refer to those people as their ancestors. And so an oral history may be telling you about a different type of lineage than you were talking about in your genetic test. So I think there's also, you know, it's a challenging conversation because sometimes we are trying to lay over one ideology of thinking about what an ancestor means, and actually different peoples have different ways of thinking about what it means to be an ancestor and how those stories are passed on in their families. And sometimes, we need to appreciate that as well.
Absolutely. I mean, even just thinking about my own genealogy and that of my kids as well. So for instance, myself, my mum is from Ilesha, and she's from a specific tribe called Ijebu, who are known in Nigeria for being relatively recent. And the oral history suggests that they were migrated from the Sudan region somewhere. Sudan could mean anything. Doesn't mean modern day Sudan. It could mean probably anywhere along the Sahelian belt, essentially. But that's where they came from. My dad is from Ondo State, who once again, oral history says that they originate from Benin, Benin Empire. And then I look at my kids who are half Nigerian, half Vincentian. Like, well, no. 3/4 Nigerian, 1/4 Vincentian, because their mum is half Nigerian, half Vincentian. They're Nigerian half, so that's their granddad. He's Yoruba again. However, his surname is Williams.
Where did that come from?
So you know, I don't think he's necessarily recently mixed like many people would assert. I think that there's a much more interesting tale behind that surname, where that came from. On
Yeah.
top of that, though, there's also very recent
Hmm.
kind of oral history of
Yeah.
migration from somewhere around Sierra Leone or Liberia.
Sure.
So all of that gets lost because you're just, oh, we're just Nigerian, you're Yoruba, isn't it? It's
Yes.
like, well,
Yes.
no, you don't. This is
Yeah.
what I kind of try to explain to people. People think that you've got these hard lines that kind of
Yeah.
like define people. It's kind of like, no, this is just, I've got a very, very, I
Yeah.
don't think very kind of like extreme example of what it means to be a modern day Nigerian.
Mm.
Nigerians overlap ethnographic,
Sure.
tribal, like
Yeah.
constantly.
And
And it's
that's
not a
the
big
whole
deal.
of
Yeah,
Africa, right? So,
yeah,
one of the things that we didn't touch on is, this mixing of genes, this recombination that I spoke about, that happens kind of with every generation. What that means is the genes are mixed up and then changes are happening. And this has been happening since, the dawn of our creation. And we're a very recent species, and we spent a long time in Africa doing that, moving up and down, DNA being passed on. So in terms of kind of that diversity that we see in the human population, like all of these different changes and things, most of that we see in Africa, in the African populations before we migrated. So again, like when we're looking at these kind of genetic tests and genetic references, and they don't give, the best type of information that we would even want from tests, because the best test would be a test whose reference was a sample from everybody in the world.
yeah.
But and we're far from that. But even what we have done, which is, taken us even further away from that, is we've gone to the populations that are the least diverse first. So by looking at these kind of European populations that are later in this migration around the world, a lot of that very rich diversity that you can just talk about even in just your family is something that's not well represented in lots of the databases that we use. So there are lots of initiatives by kind of African scientists on the continent of Africa trying to get that diversity and get that understanding. Because for a long time, you would go and get, your blood pressure test or whatever, and they would tell you that, if you're Black, it means that you should be on this particular kind of medication. And when they were talking about Black, they're talking about the samples of populations of like 70 people that they tested who were in America. And I think I told you about Shegun Fatuma. They had done a piece of research that showed that there was, like, using DNA from African Americans held very little information for looking at the DNA of the population of people who were from Uganda. And so again, this huge diversity that we have in Africa means that even though out of these 30,000 genes, we might have some surface genes that are making us look a particular way that makes us feel very closely related, actually what's going on in our DNA can be hugely different. You look at populations like Brazil, and just knowing how much African DNA they have is really hard to judge just by looking at them because of how mixed that population is.
Absolutely. I mean, what you just said just makes my mind jump to so many different things, because it's like this problem that you just highlighted that we have in genetics is something that seems to follow throughout academia when it comes to the African continent. The diversity of the African continent just simply doesn't seem to be respected. I remember I had there was this study that I was looking at that was about basically it was for plastic surgeons. And the protocols they should be following for, obviously for the different facial types. When it came to, they had a facial type and it was just Black. It was amazing. And what was and this is the thing, what was amazing about this is that they had Europe broken up into all of these different groups.
And we just
but Black people was essentially just Black. And the study what I was looking at was looking at the face of a Sudanese woman, a North Sudanese woman, was Black, who before this study, people from that region would have just got the Black treatment. But then after this study, they realized these people even fit. So this is phenotype we're talking about, physical kind of appearance as opposed to genetics. But these people look completely different on average. So they're dark skin, they're Black skin, we would call them Black people, but they're just tapped into a tiny amount of that diversity we have in Africa. And it's like, well, these people have got completely different nasal index, completely different naphic index, completely different expression, like everything across the board. On an average, we're completely different. We need to create a group for them. Well,
yes.
Bravo, well done. Any African could have told you that. Do you know how many where, and it's like the diversity that you get in Africa is so overlooked and disrespected. So this is, I want to kind of like target in on this for a second. Let's talk about African genetic diversity and what it looks like in comparison to European or another group. Let's say European, because that's probably the most in a group, European genetic diversity. But then what the differences are like in terms of the data that's held in both of these groups.
So I think, so it's interesting that you think that African diversity is overlooked, because I wanna ask, when you say that, by who do you mean? Do you mean us? Do you mean anthropology? Or
I'm normally coming from the field of anthropology or something historical, like anywhere where that data is needed, it's always ignored. So just to give a very, very quick example, when they're doing things like comparison of Egyptian skulls, for instance, so they got this pool of ancient Egyptian skulls. What they'll do very sneakily, but very deliberately, is they'll try and find the population that's most phenotypically distant in Africa to represent their black sample. And then they'll go, oh well, these skulls of the Twa tribe, or the San tribe don't seem to match, these ancient Egyptians. In fact, the ancient Egyptians look closer to the Europeans, so therefore, they weren't black. That's the kind of, they won't say that, but they will say it basically in their study, and they'll ignore all of that diversity that they could have reached from and probably found an exact match. They'll ignore that. So it's, to me, when I see it done, I see it being done quite deliberately as an exclusion tactic. I know it's probably very different in the field of genetics, but I guess that's what I was referencing from.
Okay, all right. Because I'm not from anthropology, so
tell me about the genetic world.
What I will say is, in the genetic world, the diversity of Africa is not overlooked at all. So because we are all related essentially as a human species, and we need to create groups to compare things, to make understandings about the genes in humans and what they do. If you do that without the group that has the most amount of diversity, you kind of your discovery rate kind of slows down, right? So modern genetics very much understands that they can't get to all the answers they need to get to without the full diversity of African DNA and other indigenous populations of DNA around the world not in the database. So that's really important for us to keep hold of as Africans and African diasporans, that the pursuit of genetic understanding, which the world is trying to race to, so not anthropology, but this modern understanding of genetics, absolutely needs your DNA in order to solve these questions and this problem. And so it's really important that we are aware of how that is happening, like who is coming to get the data, who is in control of the research projects that we're doing, what African scientists are doing the work and mining the data, because it gives answers for populations that are not African and African diasporan, but also it means, as I said, that it helps to answer the questions that are limited in understanding for us. And that I use critical race theory a lot. And essentially what we're talking about is interest convergence, because I wouldn't say that most Europeans are going around thinking, I really think we need to find the answers so that we can help all the African and African descendants around the world. But there is an interest for them as well, that actually we would have better information about what we need to know about the human population, and therefore ourselves, if we have that DNA as well. So that, in a sense, is kind of why I was pushing back a little bit on like who ignores it, because they can't ignore it. And that's kind of where we've got to, is in genetics in particular, is that diversity of data that they need is very much high on the agenda for them. I probably went like off on a tangent.
No, it was
wanted to put that in, that there is a power in knowing that our DNA is diversity and that it is needed for the understanding of the human race.
It was a really good answer, and it made me think about something that I said earlier about me not being genetically tested. But then there's a catch-22 that you've clearly highlighted there.
How are we going to know if we don't have the DNA?
Exactly. So my question to you is, and this is obviously a question that you're probably going to struggle to answer, but a lot of me not giving my genetic information over is rooted in distrust, and I'm a very distrusting person. I'm going to be totally honest with you. I'm very distrusting of them holding information. I've been in a situation where they've needed my thyroid information for something, and I was like, no. You know, can we take blood? No, go else. I don't like giving them anything, literally. So I'm very, very distrusting. Where can I draw the line? Where is there a situation where you think, you know what, look, this is how you contribute in a safer way?
Sure. Absolutely. So the first thing I will say is that conversation about trust and trust and mistrust is a really layered one and a really interesting one. I wouldn't encourage anyone to just trust because there are historical and contemporary reasons why we should be concerned about the benefits that we get from a system that is unequally stacked against us, right? So I do not think that it is without good reason that particular populations do not trust their data and their health to particular institutions, even institutions that I work for. So I get that, and I think that that's absolutely right. So what that means is there's a responsibility on you. So sometimes you might need it because for you individually and your family, you're not going to get the best health care if you don't do it. So there's that. So there's sometimes you have no choice. There are ways to think about whether the information is ethical. So when people are asking for your data, having a good understanding of the informed consent process, how they're going to store your data, why they would need to keep your data, how they're going to store the DNA. So storing the DNA and storing the data from the DNA are two different things. And so in any consent, they might offer you both of those things and say they need both of them. They may offer you for things to be destroyed once they have got what they need from it. There may be clauses that say that they can't reuse the data for anything else. So there's all those types of questions that as a genetic counsellor, that's part of the conversations often that I have with people when they're having genetic tests. Is this really detailed, informed consent process, which a lot of these direct-to-consumer tests that do ancestry tests, like 23andMe and Ancestry, you don't have that depth of conversation to help you understand what the protocols are for your data being held, used, or destroyed. So I think when you're searching for private companies, direct-to-consumer companies to have those types of tests, looking for that type of information should be part of the decision about having that test, or finding somebody who can have that conversation with you, I think is probably more important. And then there'll be like the legal framework of the country that you're in. So again, somewhere like the US, where we have a private health system, and you may feel a different, but so sending your samples. So a lot of these ancestry test companies, the tests are done over in the US. So again, how do you feel about the politics and the data governance in the country, even though you might want to have a nice test to talk about like where you're to find your second cousin or find out if your dad's your dad. Like these are all the other questions that kind of go along with those types of tests. And then, as I said, there are African scientists and there are African labs. And so I know that the African ancestry test company, for instance, they destroy your DNA as soon as they've used it. So there are other, they're black owned, black run, and they destroy the DNA. So there are other, you need to do some research, I would say, in order to thinking about it, because I can't give a blanket statement about you can just trust the scientists in this country or this jurisdiction. That trust is about you and about what you want with your data and what you don't want done with your data.
When you say they destroy your DNA,
yeah,
you mean they destroy the data from your DNA, or they destroy the sample?
They routinely destroy the DNA sample.
Okay.
So some people routinely destroy the DNA sample. In the NHS, for instance, we don't routinely destroy the DNA sample. So unless
how long does it keep for?
A DNA sample for life,
yeah,
for generations. So, for instance, I might see a family, and that's really important, because I might see a family for whom, like, we get one of these VUSs, for instance, or we don't quite get the answer. So, say, like, for you, like, we've done a test and we don't have the answer, but you really wanted your family to benefit from this in some way, even though you wouldn't benefit from it. In an NHS setting, that means 2-3 generations down the line, if someone comes and says, my great-great-granddad stored his DNA because you were wondering about this in my family and now this many more people are affected, could we retest? We can go back and retest the most appropriate person in the family. So in the NHS, unless you ask for the data, the sample itself to be destroyed, we don't routinely destroy the sample because we can use it. And we wouldn't use it for another purpose unless we had permission to use it for a different purpose.
That's amazing. So tell me, what's the common method of collecting DNA by the NHS, and I'm just very fascinated by this. What's the preservation? I just thought it was like a bit of spit in the tube, and then once they got the data, they chuck it away. But you're saying no.
So the spit in the tube tends to be the ones that you send to the ancestry sample, where you take the buccal cells from inside the cheek, and they have DNA in them. For NHS testing, we use blood, so we often will use a blood test. We can use saliva, but it's a better quality if we use a blood sample and then extract the DNA from blood.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you very much. That's like really, really informative. And actually, someone's just agreed with that. Daryl K, thank you for your $5 donation. Appreciate it. So this podcast is so fire and informative. Sasha is dope. And so are you, King. Thank you very much. And I knew Sasha was dope. I think she knows that this is not going to be her last appearance on this channel. She knows already. She's already resigned to that fact. Thank you so much. Appreciate that donation. All right, so let's get down to some brass tacks. So we've talked a lot here and talked around lots of different things.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a very straightforward question. Can you prove race from DNA?
No.
Expand.
It's like, is that it? No. Okay, so race is a social construct of how society has decided to describe people based on physical appearance. Historically, the idea of race was pushed forward in order to group a whole continent of very diverse people together to justify a slave trade, right? Essentially, that we were like, how are we going to distinguish between this Arabic slave trade and this slave trade of Africans? Okay, let's start describing these groups of people. And what that meant was that these groups also had characteristics assigned to them. So I think we spoke about these very early kind of 17th century descriptions of Negroids and Caucasoids and that were given, and also Mongoloids that were given these characteristics that went along with them, that, like, you know, the Negroids were untamed and the Caucasoids were genteel. And these were completely arbitrary groupings made by one scientist and then kind of supported by another scientist based on nonsense like, I have some skulls that I collected and I found one in the Caucasus Mountains and it's really beautiful. So I'm going to name, I really like the way that one looks. So I'm going to name the Europeans Caucasoids.
So that's you guys, just to cut in really quickly, you guys,
literally, it's just a beautiful skull. It was the most beautiful one that he had.
we did a live stream about Blumenbach, and we spoke about this. There's I'm not sure if you're well of
yeah,
a writer or author called Nell Painter, Dr. Nell Painter. She covers this subject extensively, and we did a live stream about this subject. So yeah, we're very aware of Johann Blumenbach and his infatuation with the Caucasoid skull and his skull collection. It's a wild story, but yeah, anyway, carry on.
Wild story. And obviously, as I mean, this is a social construction, so it's like they're not the first. That wasn't the first time that we'd ever decided to separate kind of people in these particular ways. But that construction is the construction that essentially we have never really gotten away from. We just have different ways of reordering it, different ways of talking about it. But because that construction is mostly about what you look like, and you have 30,000 genes, 25,000, some people say, when you look at someone's DNA, it can tell you who they are similar to and where they might be placed in the world. It cannot tell you what they look like. So if you have a description of race that is about phenotype, and genotype doesn't tell you necessarily what somebody looks like, it tells you about the matching of their DNA to people who are similar than them, then absolutely not. Right. It can be a bit of a coincidence or a bit of a proxy, sometimes they call it, but it's a pretty poor proxy. So no, because race is not a genetic construct. You can't really use genetics to prove that there are races, but you can prove that there are populations of people who have similar genetic ancestry from different parts of the world.
Amazing. Thank you for that very in-depth answer. And actually I'm going to jump back a little bit now, back to the idea of African genetic diversity, because I do think this is a really important subject to really get under the hood of. I did a live stream not too long ago, and I think I mentioned this to you about a paper done by Shamaka Keita called Interpreting African Genetic Diversity. And in this paper, he essentially explained that all of this genetic diversity that historians and anthropologists are arguing over and claiming these markers to this geolocation and that geolocation, he essentially says that the genetic diversity in the human genome predates a lot of the overt phenotypic changes that we've experienced. So that those things that we classify as so important now, as in skin complexion, blah blah blah, he's saying no, all of that genetic diversity
happened already.
All of these markers that you're trying to, so all of that happened in Africa. And what happened is these Africans, you have to call them Africans at this stage because they hadn't been anywhere else, carry these out in a series of different migrations quite consistently that took place. So they carried out this. So as a result of that, all of that genetic diversity that you see across the globe still exists in Africa and always has existed in Africa. But what you have in the field that we're into, and a lot of people in the chat will understand this as well, is every time some kind of marker turns up that has been laid claim to elsewhere in the world,
you can trace
it turns up in Africa. It will always turn up in Africa, somewhere in Central West or Central East Africa. It will turn up, it's guaranteed. And they'll go, oh yeah, there was a back migration that took place. That's always the explanation. So apparently there's been thousands of these back migrations to Africa, thousands of back migrations to the dark continent. The dark continent that nothing ever happened to, somehow large populations of people found themselves back there.
Decided to go back again.
Always going back again. Everyone came back. It's not even like some. Everyone came back to Africa, the dark continent. So in my mind, then there's only really two conclusions, isn't there? There's the one is that Shamaka Keita was right, and that these things were carried out, and therefore it's a shared marker between Africa and wherever else it ended up. Or two, you were lying about the dark continent, because really, if Africa was so dark, why did everything end up back there? Why didn't it end up in, Mesopotamia or some of these other places that you say where all the trade was happening? Why did everyone come back to Africa? Surely they should have all the genes because everyone was trading there. That's my layman's man speaking. Correct me as a geneticist.
So I think, you know, that comes into people, I guess, the way that different disciplines think about things, and the way that people perpetuate their racist ideology, and their understanding of African and African histories, and reimagine the story using science. And then it just doesn't make sense because it's just, you just made up the story. So I think that you'll find different branches of like population science that actually don't have these same ideas. Possibly maybe that anthropology. So anthropology has a huge history of racist ideology. Like it's founded on racist ideology. The way that it performs now, it still has huge issues with that. So sometimes, you know, and even a lot of right-wing politicians, they often will use genetic information that doesn't say that at all and reframe it to hold up scientific racism. So that's a huge problem with things that end up in the media, things that people are using as facts, is that sometimes things that were not even intended to uphold those positions are used to uphold someone's position. So this idea that scientists are objective, I think is one of the things that's kind of really important, is that they are people. And so people can manipulate statistics and data to support any particular position that they want to hold. And so I think that part of the answer is that sometimes the explanation sounds ridiculous because it's clearly not that explanation. You're using it to uphold a mindset that you already hold, rather than being a real scientist and saying, how do I disprove myself? Because that's the point of science, right? Is there any evidence that disproves what I think? That's what you should be doing all the time, is trying to see if I can disprove what I think. And there are a lot of scientists who don't do that. So I think that there is that. But then again, I think it goes back to this idea of like what people look like when they made these migrations. And this idea, as I said, that's embedded, that people looked a particular way when they arrived at particular places in the world. And so because you tie that to genetics, you found this in people who look this way now, and you cannot conceive that they may be related to people who don't look like them, or didn't look like that when they left and brought it with them. So I think there's a lot of these I guess kind of racial biases about the ways that particularly Western science thinks about populations and of people from Africa. I went a bit,
No, you twirled to a perfect dismount.
I nailed it.
It was honestly, because I think one of the things that you just said there to me that I think really struck a chord is, and I want people to really take this away, is the fact that it's very possible for someone to have genes that look like someone who looks completely different to them. I think that's basically what you said. Is that true? So that basically people can look
absolutely possible. Yeah.
And
I was sorry.
Go on. No, you go.
I was just gonna give you like some tea about how I how I have to deal with this embedded Eurocentric thinking. Is she was presenting something or whatever, and she used a quote about something that happened in a clinic where they asked somebody to check you have to check those boxes, black, white, other, whatever. And she had asked the patient, what's your ancestry, like what's your ethnicity? And the patient had said white, British. And she had thought, well, I don't think you are. And then was like kind of trying to press this person to like tick a different box or have a different, and this is somebody that like works in genetics. So again, like this understanding that actually, if that person's ancestry, like what are we looking for? So if that person feels that their ancestry is white British, then I don't see how you can decide it isn't unless you've done a genetic test.
But then even the genetic test doesn't prove anything.
And even so the genetic test doesn't prove anything. But you know, because they are often conflating white Britishness with European population. And so that person may be absolutely right. Like maybe their ancestry is European population. And so if you put them in a test, you might show up in a cluster with people that you wouldn't cluster with if we were looking at you, basically.
That's amazing. Actually, I'm reminded of a friend of mine who I obviously won't name, but we always had a laugh because he was from a really dark-skinned family, and he was like properly, like, they said he was a throwback, but everyone used to have this joke about the milkman, and because he was so light, he was like properly pale, properly pale, and all of his like siblings looked like me. And so we always used to have like a massive laugh at his expense. I don't think he found it that funny, but yeah, sorry. So, but it's possible, is the point I'm trying.
It's possible. Genes do funny things, and you know, we had this discussion before offline about like what does phenotype mean, and we're using it in a you know, in a very reductionist way, like to just talk about actually what you kind of like what you physically look like, but it's all sorts of things that are just not in your genotype. And so that means that you might have things in your genotype that show up in what you look like and things that don't. So, you know, one of the classic things that we think about is eye color. And that thing, you know, what has constructed your eye color is present in your genotype, but it might not necessarily be present in your phenotype and the way that you see it. And even the way that we understand eye color is really reductionist, that it's actually a lot more complicated than we thought about how these eye colors show up. And so, yes, we see things and we're like, that's surprising. Where did that come from? And these things are just there. So, yeah.
You know, it reminds me, you probably won't be aware of this. I was having a very public kind of spat/debate with another Reconstruction artist last year. And we messaged each other because we're frenemies. And he was messaging me and he showed me a reconstruction that he had done that he was really proud of. I'm trying to remember who it was. I'm not going to go through my phone on a live stream, but it was one of these old kind of like Renaissance artists. I can't remember. It was one of them basically. And he showed me the reconstruction that he had done of him. And in all his paintings, this guy has got brown hair and brown eyes. And he said, oh, here's my reconstruction. The reconstruction had blonde hair and blue eyes. And I said, that's incorrect. Why did you give him blonde hair and blue eyes? He said, oh, the paintings were incorrect. They did his genome. They tested his genome and they found out he had blonde hair. He had 80% chance of having blonde hair and blue eyes. And I was like, well, the 20% won, because we can clearly see here that he's got brown hair and brown eyes. Like, what you don't correct his portraits. Like, what the hell's going on here? So this is kind of like an idea, that's just an example of how people just misinterpret what the genome's telling them and how it affects physical phenotype. Can we get a breakdown there? Because you did touch on it, and I asked you this question before, and I think this is quite important. The Human Genome Project, the kind of like guidance statement, or the mission statement, so to speak, was to find out or to discover the link between genotype and phenotype. That was kind of, I know I've paraphrased that awfully, but that's kind of how I read it.
Far from that. It was literally just to map out every single gene in the body.
Okay. I'm sure I've seen that phrase.
What the genes do is what we're doing, what we have been doing ever since. But that was where we started, was literally to write the entire code.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so have they got there? Yes, I mean, they've said they've mapped the human genome now.
Yeah, so they mapped the human genome. They have a reference of the entire code of the human genome. So all of those, so, you know, I spoke about those 23 pairs of chromosomes, and your chromosomes come in matching pairs, and you can think of those like books. So essentially, we have all of those books, and we have all of the letters in the books that tells us exactly what is in the books. But that's just a reference. So it used a handful of like genomes from different people, and made this amalgamated kind of reference point. And then increasingly, then they had to keep testing more. And then you had like the Human Genome Diversity Project, which was then to actually try and expand that reference point to understand a bit more. And then everything we do in genetics is about trying to link the function of those genes to actually what it does in the body. And we are still figuring out the functions of what these genes are. So mapping these different genes against what every gene on those chromosomes actually does. And then we have all of like the epigenetic DNA, so the DNA that's not on the coding bits. And I say coding, it's not quite the right bit. We thought that one was code and one was junk, but they're not. There's also work to figure that out as well. So yes, it was just to map it out like a picture. Yeah.
So am I getting this correct? Because I could be wrong. Because as you were speaking, instantly my mind was going to, well, what's the difference between DNA that actually maps, does something, and DNA that is just there? Is that how they define the difference between junk DNA and coding DNA?
That was originally how they, when they started figuring out the structure of this DNA, that was originally how they thought about the structure, that this chemical structure that had these kind of chemical letters that recurred, that was kind of the code. And then that code told a certain protein to be formed, and then that protein would do a certain job. And they believed that was the order of things of what kind of DNA did. But then there was all this other DNA that wasn't coding for a protein. So they're like, oh, this is just junk DNA. But actually, it was like 98% of the genome or something that was this supposed kind of junk DNA. And then the thinking around that process, gene, protein, function, has changed somewhat. So we know that we need genes that turn certain genes on or off, genes that do different things if you inherit them from your father or if you inherit them from your mother, genes that maybe don't use that kind of gene protein function pathway. So there were all these other ways of understanding what the entirety of DNA does. And so this concept of like coding and junk or coding and non-coding is kind of not kind of the way of thinking. It's just the language that has followed the original way of thinking, that we know that there's probably a lot that these bits of non-coding DNA actually do. Different pathways that they actually do a function, but just not in that same function.
So the thinking is towards most DNA does something, either DNA or, does it all do something? Like
Probably, but there's
like
a lot.
The appendix is just there. We don't quite know
what we don't know than we do know. I think that's the answer. So again, when people have this idea that certain types of tests are accurate, and I'm like, well, actually, they're just using probability or statistics. Or if you have a genetic test, it gives you a definitive answer. Well, it gives you an answer to the best of our knowledge, and we have references that aren't quite accurate yet, and knowledge about the genes that we don't all have. So I'm pretty sure a lot of people have the assumption now, because there's so much work being done into kind of epigenetics and these other genes, that there is a lot more that goes into this very complicated function of a human being that we just don't kind of understand about. Yeah.
That's amazing. So in terms of I just want to kind of like linger on that just a little bit more, because this idea that people have got this entire genome, and then we have 99.9% of our genes in common with each other, and then that last 0.1%, 0.1% is where the difference lies. And then of that, obviously it's increased slightly now, but 98% was junk DNA. So only 2% of that different DNA was actually meaningful difference.
No. So the first percentage, the 99.9% is everything, junk and not junk.
Oh, got it. Yeah. Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, great. Okay, so no, that's really clear. Thank you for clarifying that. All right, so in terms of the going back to African genotypic diversity, because we touched on that again. Dr. Selena Brace, who we mentioned when we were having a bit of a chit chat, who I'm a bit of a fan of, she mentioned that in the, and I'm just using this as an example, in Europe you have, I think, 4 genes that determine light skin, basically, that kind of have an effect on complexion. I don't know if the SLC45A2, SLC245A,
Yeah.
TYR and something else. I can't remember what they are. But yeah, so 4 genes. And then, but she mentioned that in Africa, there are around 100 genes that can affect it, that can affect
skin color.
Skin color.
Yeah.
Is that kind of ratio, because that in my mind is the kind of ratio in terms of the difference that you get in terms of how genotypically diverse Africa is in comparison to the rest of the world. Is that a fairish ratio across the genome? What's your, in terms of how diverse?
I think that's a really good example of the difference, like literally the exponential difference in diversity that we talk about when we talk about looking at African genomes compared to genomes outside of Africa. Absolutely. I don't know if those numbers are correct, because things change all the time and they may have discovered a lot more genes, but in terms of the order of difference between the amount of different types of genes for different phenotypes that you would find in Africa, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so that's really interesting, because that makes it kind of paints it really clearly how impossible and ridiculous it is. Because if you're going to look at that fairly, then essentially you're saying that when it comes to representing the African genome, if you're doing any kind of comparative study, you need to have 20 times more samples taken from African populations.
That question, so because, as I said, genetics, they're like, we need representative data, and the measure of representation that they use is like the representation in the UK, right? So we need, what is it? What are we? 8%, 9%, this and blah, 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 that, and blah, blah, right? And I'm always like, well, actually, you don't. You need an overrepresentation compared to the population here, because if this minoritized population are descended from a really diverse group of people, you actually need to oversample in order to get the same kind of findings. And so this is like one of the things that I that just like grinds my gears, is that this idea of representation and oversampling that is needed, that you got to in an hour and 52 minutes. I'm still arguing with people about. And like, we have so much European population data that sometimes I'm almost like, I don't even know why you're collecting anymore. Like, just stop now. Because everything you could need to find, you might be able to find there. But then I'm given the same arguments, which are, based on these global south, global north arguments and lower middle income companies, that there's no bias or intention about this. It's just that because of where you can easily get access to get samples or do research, these happen to be in the West. And that's where these differences lie. It's not an intentional thing. And that is open for conversation, but not here. I don't need to have that conversation with you.
I can imagine it must be very, very tiring. All right, so
it's tiring. It's tiring when there's not many of you as well. So so anyway.
You said on a previous, because I was going through all of your stuff. You've got, by the way, Sasha's got loads of interviews online, so if you're enjoying this chat, I think she's always this interesting, so feel free to find her online. That's Sasha Henriques. She's got lots of different interviews, and we'll definitely have her back on the channel. You mentioned in one of your, and I'm not sure if you're going to remember this, but I'm going to put you on the spot. You said, quote, "We are very accommodating," but you didn't say it as a compliment. Talking about, you did. You said, I think you were talking about the Black community. You said we're very accommodating, and I kind of wanted you to, if you can remember, cast your mind.
I don't know what I was saying. Is it stuff I can't say on? Is it stuff I can't say online? Become a work for the people. Them. You brought it online, and I'm like, I have a government job.
It was an online interview. This is all from your YouTube stuff. You said, "Oh, we're very accommodating."
What was I talking about?
It might have been with the Day After guys. Brent, do you remember?
Was it Brent? Was it something Brent got out of me? Probably. Maybe. Look, it's just somebody. The Day After's just there laughing in the chat.
Yeah. I want an explanation of that. I want an expansion. Yes, he said it was on his chat. It was on his podcast. All right. Well,
I said that us, we're very accommodating.
You said he said, you know what I'm talking about.
Honestly, I mean, I could think of a few things.
He said, let the lady keep her
But they
job.
don't seem to relate to this conversation. Thank you. Let me keep my job. Thanks.
All right, cool. I'm not gonna do a Brent and out you. Yeah, so I'm gonna move on.
Offline.
All right, so I'm gonna skip my question about the Sanger in Welcome Sanger as well then, because you still want
to skip it.
Oh, do you want to touch on the Sanger and Welcome Sanger?
I haven't published my PhD yet, so.
Oh, let's touch on the Sanger and Welcome Sanger then. I thought you definitely didn't want to touch on it. So is that Sanger? Is that Sanger related to Margaret Sanger by any chance?
Who's Margaret Sanger? I know Henry Wellcome.
Okay, you don't know Margaret Sanger? Eugenics, no. America.
No.
Okay. All right.
No,
so
it's not related. The Sanger
not
is not
related.
Oh,
however, they're not related.
I mean, as in,
okay.
not Margaret Sanger the person.
Okay.
However, the connection between genetics and eugenics, just generally, there is a connection, right? So, we had eugenics first before we had genetics, right? So, and even like the idea of, kind of trees and whatever. And so the big distinction, I think, that clinical genetics tries to make that's different from eugenics is that you don't force genetic testing for a start. You're not trying to eradicate people, and you're not saying that some people deserve to exist and other people don't deserve to exist based on their race. So genetics tries very hard to say that it stands for something very different than the eugenics past. But lots of prominent geneticists, early geneticists, were the ones that support, like, it was a scientific idea. Like, it wasn't something that was just created by people just having a drink down the pub. Like, so these were, and even like statistics that we use and stuff now are from people that supported those ideas, like Pearson and Fisher. And so no, it's Fred Sanger, who's the Wellcome Sanger, not Margaret. But
okay, brilliant.
Yeah. Okay.
That's good. I just wondered, so it was nice to ask that question, but it was also excellent to get a bit of an expansion there about eugenics being in some ways the progenitor to modern genetics, but obviously losing some of that baggage along the way. I would say. Good. It needs to have, because we didn't get anything good from eugenics. So I want to talk to you about I mean, there's so much I want to talk to you about, so I'm definitely gonna have to have you back on here. I want to chew it off a little bit because we are gonna wrap up soon. I think just for the sake of it's been going 2 hours now, and we're 2 hours in. I did want to chew your ear off a little bit about sampling technologies, because I think some of these things kind of pop up and it would be good to get an explanation. So I want to start off first off on PCR, what PCR is and how it works, because I've met some people who are skeptical about PCR introducing bias into genetic data. And I don't know if that's correct. So I wanted to ask an expert, where would that, because I understand that PCR does some amplification work and it does it based on probabilities, based on what's been sampled already, which is where I'm guessing the idea of bias comes in. What's your view on PCR and its ability to introduce bias in what's being sampled?
PCR, polymerase chain reaction. I'm trying to think like where the biases would come in, because that's just the chemical process of breaking down the DNA, shaking it around, putting markers, them attaching, and then it kind of amplifying it and then collecting it into groups. And then being able to read the code from the ways that they attach after you've amplified it.
So I guess I don't know, but the argument I've heard it's in the amplification process. But that I
You
wouldn't, I have
amplify
no
it. You
idea.
amplify.
So,
I'm not a wet lab scientist, so I don't
okay.
know. But I'm trying to think. I'm like, from what I remember from my training, you're amplifying based on the sample that's there. You're not introducing anything new.
Okay.
So that's where I'm like, I don't understand where the bias comes in. I can understand where error comes in, but I don't know if I don't know if you would call that. Yeah, it's like, I can understand like that. You always have error with like any type of test. So in that amplification, there might be things that amplify better than other things, for instance. And so when you're doing a reading, you might not get a good reading based on the quality of the sample or the quality of the amplification. So every test has bias. I don't know if that's what you mean by the bias, or if you mean something else.
I guess I don't mean anything. I'm kind of
Okay.
I've tried to interpret a question I've been asked,
Yeah.
and make sense of it. And I think you've helped me to make some sense of it, basically.
Yeah.
But I guess the idea, I guess the picture I had in my mind was,
yeah,
what are they using to amplify? And coming from a data background, all I can think of is some kind of an algorithm. But then an algorithm has to be based on a set of past experiences. So I guess in my mind, that's why when I heard it, I was like, I need to ask this question because I need to figure out if it's a possibility.
It's the DNA copying itself. Like it's forcing this process of the DNA amplifying itself, and then you use the machine to read that. So you ramp it up or mix samples together, and then you can use a machine to read that. So
got it.
That
So you're getting the DNA to copy itself.
Yeah, the PCR.
Okay,
the PCR is not the computer, like, as you said, like the algorithm bit. That's not the PCR. The PCR is the reaction in the tube.
Excellent.
Tube,
this is why you're here, Sasha. That's amazing. All right, brilliant. So you've answered the question perfectly there. So that's fantastic. Thank you. Another question I wanted to ask you is about next generation sequencing, which was a big change. Just explain it to everyone, because I think that was a massive kind of, like, I guess, pivot in the way DNA was sampled, particularly in my field, ancient DNA. So next generation sequencing came along. Why was it such a revolution in terms of the way DNA was being captured?
So the original type of sequencing, the sequencing before next generation, was just really slow. So basically, these reactions that we were talking about, you could only kind of sequence in a linear fashion, one at a time. And so sequencing, like at the time when they were doing like the Human Genome Project, that's the reason it took years and years and years, because it actually took that long to read through the sequence of DNA. So with the advent of kind of this next generation sequencing, you were able to sequence multiple genomes kind of all like really quickly and all at the same time. And so this was like a huge revolution in being able to generate a huge amount of genetic data much, much quicker than before. So the cost of sequencing genes, so the cost of kind of reading the sequence in a gene, just reduced really drastically with next generation sequencing. And so more and more sequences were being able to be generated. And I guess, therefore, more and more information was then being able to be accessed. But the important thing about that is, just as I said, like just what you're doing in the tube, you still have to interpret it. And so that's when you were talking about like, where is the bias and where is the check? It's the bit after. So next generation sequencing, PCR, these are all kind of processes. And then actually, once you've generated all that data, it's how you interpret that data that makes any value of what you've done. And that bit never has not moved as fast as the technology. Like the technology just moves so fast. And actually the interpretation of what all this information means is actually where the challenges are, and where things like the bias can come into play. Particularly if you start to use machine learning in order to understand all of these huge amounts of data. So yeah, I always tell people, if they have kids and we want more of us, the kind of roles that we want more of us to be doing, things like, bioinformatics and stuff. absolutely
doing that.
necessary.
I'm pushing that right now in my household. I'm trying to push a couple of them. Okay, so I mean that's a really nice segue into another question I did want to ask you was in terms of the, obviously you've spoken to us about the field of genetic counselling, the fact that you were the first Black one and you've been to South Africa and there weren't any. How much from your knowledge or experience is this a reflection of the entire field of genetic studies, and how important is it that there is more representation across the board?
Yeah, really good question. Because we're talking about human genetics, right? And there's genetics of everything. So, and so one of the things I think that's really important is that when we're talking about our presence in the understanding of genetics, it's kind of everywhere. So I know, I can't remember his name, African scientist called Ebenezer, can't remember what his name is. So he's doing lots of kind of genetic analysis of, like microbes and parasites. And like, so all of these things are really important to the advancement of kind of populations and development as well. So when we're talking about representation, there's like, yes, representation in the data, but there's also like, that's about humans, but there's also representation in the data that's about animals, that's about trees, that's about disease, that's about vaccines, that's about virus, and all of that relies on genetic technology, genetic understanding, this bioinformatics, computational geneticists. So that representation is across everything. So it's about like who's doing the work, how the data is governed, who's asking the questions. So whether or not you get a big research grant to think about like what particular mold affects what particular tree, if that has a Western kind of viewpoint, they might not be looking at things that are important for, countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance. And that will have an effect on agriculture and development and kind of all of those types of things. So it's so that question of representation and diversity goes across everything, but also that question about, is it representative across all branches of genetics? No. So I think that same discrepancy of the scientists, who are the scientists and where is the science done, is not just in human genetics, it's across genetics. There was a great project that recently, I mean, all the scientists are still around and they're still doing work and stuff, but it was called H3 Africa. So it was this consortium of work that tried to have this different model of championing African science on African soil with African scientists, even when they were like in collaboration with other countries. And there's still kind of work rolling out from those things. So any bit I talk a lot about, obviously the only bit I know, which is kind of clinical genetics and human genetics, but there's a lot more work to be done.
Amazing. When it comes to the, you made a statement and you said that Black research projects don't get funded or struggle to find funding.
Look at you. Pulling out all the things I said. Yeah, go on.
Oh, I've got loads, but I'm not gonna hit you too many. So can you just expand on this a little bit so my audience kind of understand what the issue is here?
Right. So there were two. I don't know if that was the phrasing I used, but I know what I can point to. So one of the things is that when we look at research bodies and the awarding that big research institutes like Wellcome, for instance, make to people who do research, NIH, Wellcome, those types of things, we have kind of racial and ethnic bias in terms of, and lower middle income country bias in terms of who are awarded as researchers. So we have statistics on that about the awarding of research. We have statistics on when who the principal investigator is. So if the principal investigators are African, or if the principal investigators are European, kind of who is like principal investigators on research. So there's kind of like work to do around that. But then there's also bias that comes into like what data sets you use. So there was a recent paper that looked at, so in the UK, we had a huge project called the UK Biobank where people donated samples and stuff. And it's created like this big genome-wide association study that studies use all the time as a data repository to kind of do bits of research on, because it's an open data source. And there was a paper that showed that even though they tried to increase the diversity of samples, so have lots of data sets now increasingly from different parts of the world, there was still a bias for researchers to use European data, even when they were using that data set and there were other data sets available. So we have all these other ways that kind of the bias of the research of European researchers being the research that people tend to go for. And, you know, we up until recently, like you couldn't have anything published unless it was published in English. Like all of these different ways are the ways that you introduce this hierarchy of what is knowledge, and how that gets passed down and passed through. So yeah, maybe that's what I was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that you just talk about that hierarchy of knowledge. It reminds me of I did a kind of video probably over a year ago now, where it was just talking about how these gates are created, and these gates are kind of like the hierarchical access of what is regarded as science or regarded as, you know, de facto or correct, and what's incorrect sits outside of that. And obviously my field, we speak about all the time the fact that we have this field called Egyptology, which is effectively a gate. So anything that is branded Egyptology or an Egyptologist, that is correct. Anyone who comes from outside of that field and tries to contribute to the conversation, no, you're not a part of this gate of study that we have created, so to speak. So it's very effective way of, you know, essentially segregating knowledge and segregating access to what's being passed on from one generation to the next. I'm just trying to think of what question to ask you next. I've got so many. So
we're not going to speak tonight.
No. All right. So tell you what I'm going to do, actually. No, you know what I'm going to do? That's a really good point. It is getting late. And I do want to open it up to the chat, if that's okay.
Okay.
Because I've been hogging you all to myself.
And, I've been trying to keep an eye on it, but it's quite hard to do this. So I don't know if so we didn't cover.
So I'm gonna open up the chat now. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to share the link to the live stream. Okay, if anyone feels brave enough to come on and ask a question, I might kick you off after one. I'm not sure. We'll see how it goes. But if anyone wants to jump on the stream and ask a couple of questions, I think that might be a good way for us to kind of. I'm gonna just pin this. 1 second. Let me pin this comment to the top. So the link to the stream is now pinned to the top of the chat. If you want to ask Sasha a question, it needs to be a good one, because as you can imagine, loads of people are going to be asking questions in the chat. So yeah, it needs to be a good one. Or if you want a shortcut, join the live stream and ask it live. If I know you, if I recognize your name, I won't require you to turn your camera on if I recognize your name. So you'll be good. All right, so we've got one person in the chat. So Dorvel, you're the first one in, and I've had you on here before. I think I had you on my last live stream, so we're gonna add you.
Yes.
Hello, sir. How you doing?
All right. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Very well.
And how was the hostess with the mostest?
How are you?
All right. The question is,
sure.
Actually, there's kind of a two-parter. I would like for you to further go into the blood purity and how religion is really pushing this blood purity aspect and how it's affecting the genetics, and also how can I say if I have a daughter that she's actually my daughter if she doesn't get my Y chromosome?
Okay, so the last bit's easy because she gets your X.
Okay.
Because you gave your Ys to your boys, you gave your X's to your girls. So that's the easy one.
Here in America,
so we have two.
Here in America, we have a saying, "Mama's baby, Papa's maybe."
Exactly. So without a test, only mummy knows. So there is that. Okay, so blood purity is really interesting because we were talking about those different ways over history people have thought about hereditary, like what you pass on. And definitely before we spoke about genetics, we spoke about blood. And so there are still, I guess, religious ideologies that use this concept of blood that is the hereditary material that kind of gets passed on. As someone who thinks more about genetics, I don't know how helpful that is, but because what I think it does is it maintains these same ideologies about these pureness and these like kind of pure racial groups. And so I think it goes hand in hand with the religious ideologies of which I don't ascribe to. So I don't know if I should say too much about it without offending people.
Well, no, the truth should not offend anybody, because if what you're saying genetically everybody's mixed up anyway. So how are you going to be pure if everybody's mixed up?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm going to jump in there really quickly.
Yeah.
Because I want you to expand on that, because I think we had that conversation in private, and I think the community needs to hear it, about the fact that there are very few, if any, populations that can really lay a claim to purity, and this idea that basically everyone else is mixed. Can you just kind of explain how that works, but in kind of like make it a bit of a tale so people understand it from, you know, in fullness.
So I think we've touched on it already, right? So we spoke about in Africa, if we were all before we migrated, we were all migrating around the continent and mixing with each other, and we've already said the vast diversity that exists within these original populations anyway. So even if we were just talking about blood, and we're not, there's a huge amount of mixing that has happened. Also, the biological process of creating a child requires this process of recombination, where the genes kind of mix up again. So this shuffling of genetic information is the survival mode of the human population. So to some degree, everybody is a mixture of everything that has ever come before. So the concept of mixture, you can only have it when you hold on to the concept of purity and race. Because once you destruct that, then that means then you're like, oh, okay, well, everyone's mixed then. But you have to impose lines so that you can call crossing between those lines some type of mixture. And so I always find that really interesting, this idea of mixed and admixture. And actually all we're ever talking about is degrees of mixture, that unless you descend from a very isolated population that hasn't moved for thousands of years, what do you mean that it's a pure race or a pure bloodline or a pure anything? That's just not a concept that holds well once you deconstruct the lines. And is that a diplomatic answer?
It's a brilliant answer. Nothing I wouldn't expect any less from someone studying their PhD. So
I know it's so hard to get out of thinking of using like PhD language for everything. Like I feel like I speak differently than I spoke 3 years ago, but it's fine.
No, it's fine, and it's excellent to hear. I think everyone's enamored with how well you articulate these ideas, because some of these are really quite difficult concepts. So thank you for making it so easy to understand.
We spoke about that, right? Like that it raises a challenge because it challenges white supremacist ideas. It challenges these racial purity ideas, but it also challenges us as a people about how we are constructing what we mean by who we are as a people, as a community, what we mean by Black, that there's not just this one narrative of how we construct that. We have to think of, we're challenged with thinking about different ways of what that means for us individually and also as a collective. And
the thing is, on this channel, in this chat, you won't have problems with white supremacy. What you'll have is a load of black supremacy. Yeah.
Yes.
And I ain't saying that in a shameful. I'm not saying that in a shameful way, because I'm telling you on this channel, people here are very much, I ain't mixed with nothing. Yeah. Which is fair. No. In some ways it's fair, because would you say it's fair to say it's quite possible for an African to have largely, if not only, African DNA? However, African DNA is very diverse anyway, which is the point we're making. So you're going to be mixed anyway, even if you're purely African.
Yes,
but
exactly.
But
you've been given this reductionist ideology that Africa is one thing.
Yeah. But then on the inverse of that, it's impossible for a non-African to not be admixed with Africans, because they all are. They all descend.
Everybody is African.
Everyone's African, essentially.
We're all descended from the same place. So.
I think the thing that makes everything is confusing is that for everybody to get their grab at the money bag, all these intellectuals, when they write their books, everybody always has to come out with a new quote unquote saying, instead of using the old word or the old saying, which covered everything fine. But for me to get my money, I got to come up with some new word to explain the exact same thing that's already been explained before.
Yeah.
That's fair. I'm going to allow due diligence to state their question now. So, hello. Due diligence, you there? How you doing?
I'm doing all right, and I'm driving, so if you can't hear me or if it's a little too loud, I'll be home in a minute and I can jump back on. If it's too loud, just let me know.
It's not too loud. You are on a hands-free though, aren't you?
Yes.
Okay. Shoot away. Go ahead.
All right. I really have more of a statement than a question, if that's okay. I just wanted to run it past the PhD while I got her on here, because I literally just finished a video yesterday about genetic diversity, and I would love for either of you to do a review on it or just to give me your thoughts on it. But my argument is genetic diversity is really a euphemism for saying that Africans are more advantageous than the rest of the world, or more superior per se than the rest of the world genetically. And if it was vice versa, if we would have found out that it was like that within white people, then it would be all over scientific journals. It would be all over the front page of the news, on the front page of the newspapers and all of that. But they use a euphemism in order to keep it, like codish. And they don't want to, just put it out there to the public the way it is, because what they have found out with genetics, with Africans being the most genetically diverse, it's where Europeans been trying to say about themselves for the longest, that they're superior in some type of way, shape, form, or fashion, and it really belongs to the African. And like you said, to understand humanity, first you have to understand the African.
See, I want to touch on that, partly to save Sasha from having to answer.
I'm sorry about that.
I can see the sweat beading up on her forehead. Go ahead, please. Go ahead.
I can answer it, because I think like these are the concepts that I am talking about in my PhD. Like because I'm using critical race theory, so I am talking about like white supremacist ideas, and these ideas that European populations hold the answers and are used as default models comes from this idea that somehow they are superior, and where that remains embedded in the understanding of genetics, even though it's not spoken, like the way that science acts is like kind of telling on itself in the fact that it's still upholding these ideas. So absolutely, I don't think it's as controversial a thing to talk on, because I think you're absolutely right that statement about the power of diversity can translate into also thinking, well, what we're talking about is the power of Africa, and how uncomfortable that might be for some people to hold and talk about. And there are really interesting ways in which words like diversity are used even in scientific journals, when I've been looking at them, that really tell a lot about how people are conceptualizing pureness and whiteness, and what diversity means and what it doesn't mean, and when it's a problem and when it's not a problem, and when it's admixture that needs to be excluded statistically from a study, or whether it's diversity and actually you quite need it. So I think it's really interesting, and I'd love to watch that video actually and see if I have any further comments.
I'll watch it as well. It reminds me of something that the guys in the channel would have heard me say quite a few times, and I will continue to fall in this. I always say that default Homo sapien sapien is the Black African man. That's from everything that we know. Is that fair to say? So if you're going to look at what Homo sapien sapien is in there, yeah, in its default form, it's an African man, yeah, because that's where Homo sapien sapien was before admixture with other.
Which one?
Homo. Well, I'm saying the one because actually, while I've got you here, that's a very good question. Exactly. Yeah,
you just said they're really diverse. So which one?
yeah, you're right. Which African man? While I've got you here, actually, that's a good question to. You might not know because I know you don't do anthropology, but no. Are you? The rumor is that Europeans Neanderthal admixture is between 1% and 3%. I think Asians is slightly higher, 2 to 4%, and they also have a Denisovan contribution. But Africans, not all, but a large proportion of Africa don't carry Neanderthal admixture. Is that still what's accepted in the field, if you're aware?
Yeah, I would say it's still. I think there were very hard and fast lines when that statement was first made, and I wonder if it's a bit more nuanced now. But but proportionality wise speaking, then yes, that would probably still be the same.
So then it's fair to say, yeah, but then which one? We know it was. So Homo sapien sapien was a black man. Let's just say that it was a black man. We're not quite sure which one. RJ has joined us in the chat. And I've got a couple more people in who are waiting in the waiting room. Just wait there. I'm gonna remove some people before I add you because I don't want this panel to be too big.
Hey team, can you and your guests drop y'all's email in the private chat so I can share the video with you guys?
Certainly, will do. RJ, shoot.
Hello, King. Hello, Miss Sasha. How are you doing?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing good. I just got a question because you were talking, because King was mentioning about, like, he mentioned something about pharaohs and how, like, they're, like, in certain DNA, like, they would show you which pharaoh you're related into whom. And I did my DNA test a while back, and it came up that on my father's side, I am related to Pharaoh Ramses III. And here's the thing, and I was shocked about that because my family's from the Caribbean, Jamaica and Guyana. And so can you explain how that got there? Because I have a little bit of Egyptian.
Yeah. It got there because we're talking about a very long time ago. And a huge number of people who are also related to Ramesses. There was like a newspaper article about how many million people come up with Ramesses III. So we're like somebody's put in the chat. It's always Ramesses III. So they put it there as like, we were talking about like the marketing of these tools. Like it's a fun fact that people like to hear from their ancestry test. But actually, there are so many other people who will also get that. And that doesn't mean that you are related to them. It means that there is a haplotype that stretches back to there that you share with lots of people.
Okay, because that was something interesting for me. Because I've seen it quite a bit with people who are, let's say, particular Europeans say that they are like connected, like they have that same thing with King Richard III of England, or like even like Luke, like the evangelist in the Bible. Like I saw it on a YouTube channel, and I was like, "What is going on here? Like, how did you get that?" So that's something to know.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
They've just and even then, it's an assumption that because often you don't have that ancient DNA. Even then, it's an assumption that the person named as that person is the person attached to that haplotype that they said belonged to that person. So again, we're just dealing with probability and statistics often anyway.
Can I ask you another question? Go ahead, Kate. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to kind of like touch on that as well, because a few years ago, I think there was a study that came out, and it was a fake study by a company called Eugenics, but basically they released King Tut's paternal lineage, and they said it was R1b, blah blah blah, something. And as a result, all the newspaper articles, and you can still find them, said King Tut related to 80% of Europeans. Yeah, because of this paternal lineage. Now, this was problematic in many ways, and I expressed this, and this is one of the reasons why when people say I know a lot of Black African people and Black people generally have that Ramesses III paternal lineage link. And I basically said, it's problematic, because if we go down the road of saying, well, this proves this, then we have to argue with their stupid argument regarding R1b, when the reality is, and we had a discussion about R1b earlier, even putting aside the fact that it originates in Africa, which is what I purely believe, if a bunch of people carry a marker in that paternal lineage, it doesn't mean the people that don't have it showing up in their paternal lineage aren't related to that same person. It just had to be, that person just had to be somewhere else in their genome. And just to kind of like, just to demonstrate that, going back to this diagram that I put up earlier, that's where your Ramesses connection lies, in that single line. Someone else could have it over here and it wouldn't show up anywhere, or over here, or anywhere along these infinite line of ancestors that you have, and it's very likely that we all just are related to everyone, particularly in Africa, like somewhere down the line, like everyone's just related to everyone, and it's not that special. These kind of markers, haplotypes, are very much party tricks. Is that fair to say? I'm always going to default because I'm saying these statements, but then I'm going to check with my geneticists.
No, I literally have heard geneticists kind of refer often to ancestry tests as, like if you go past a few generations, as I said, where they're quite accurate at finding kind of relatives and cousins and stuff. But after that point, it's entertainment.
Yeah.
And you use it in conjunction with, as I think, with the other bits of information that you have about your family. And that there are, we're talking about thousands, sometimes millions of people. And also we're talking about bits of the story that are not included as well. And also we're talking about results that might change over time.
Yeah.
I have another question for you, Sasha, Miss Sasha.
I'm gonna pause you, RJ. I'm really sorry, but I'm looking at the time, and I've got a couple other people in the chat.
Oh yeah,
I can't afford you that luxury, I'm afraid, my friend. So we'll come back to you. I'm gonna add due diligence. I'm gonna remove you if that's okay. I'm really sorry. Thank you for joining. You've got my email. I'm gonna add Andre to the stage.
Can I answer this question that you pinned to the screen? Is there a reason you pinned this?
Yes, sorry. That was one of the ones in the chat. Go ahead. Yes, please. Yeah, go ahead.
So definitely Sanger, definitely Wellcome, the Broad Institute, National Institute for Health. What's his name? CZ, Chan Zuckerberg and his wife. They have a huge amount of funding as well. Yeah.
Are they supportive from what you know of the
funders? And then there'll be small funders.
Would they be supportive of a quote unquote Black study, these funders, or are you just giving us generic DNA people who will do?
No,
DNA?
Those are some of the big funders, and some funders think more about non-American or European based studies and PIs. So Chan Zuckerberg have particular initiatives for that. I think it's called CZI or something, CZI initiative. You often have to belong to an institution to access that funding though. So I guess it's funding depending on what size of funding that you're looking for. So you'd be already part of an institution, some type of academic or research institution. Yeah. And then, as I said, the H3 Africa initiative, like it still kind of exists. It's just that they've disbanded. So there'll be individual research projects within that, some that are based in African countries as well, with African researchers. Yeah.
Amazing. I just want to be a little bit petty and touch on this one. So it says R1b doesn't originate in Africa. Your beliefs don't dictate truth and evidence that have been produced via peer review and sequencing of ancient DNA. All right, so just to touch on this, Mr. Africa teacher, first of all, that was based on a peer reviewed study, one that I've already discussed with Sasha before you came on the stream, and that was the study by Gonzalez in 2015, which mapped that genome to the that haplotype to Cameroon and the Equatorial Guinea region, and quite successfully, I think, in that paper. But that aside, what I was leaning more on was the paper that I mentioned by Shamaka Keita, which seems to have more credibility, is that a lot of these splits or these mutations in the DNA occurred on the African continent. Now, where a lot of your thinking comes from, and we were talking about this bias earlier, and this is actually something that you could jump in on, Sasha, in the field of historical anthropology and kind of like, they go by this idea, particularly because it suits them, that the oldest sample dictates origin of a genetic thing. So they'll go and they'll dig somewhere in Europe where the climate is cold, everything's frozen, and they'll obviously find some corpse that is 30,000 years old that hasn't been completely decomposed by the environment, like it happens in Equatorial Africa, for instance. And because they find the oldest sample of it there, they say this is the origin point, whereas they are not digging up anything on the African continent because, or at least very little, much comparatively less, because of the climate and because of it's not favorable to the keeping of samples.
Just so to do that type of research there.
So would you say that contributes quite a lot to the bias in terms of where these markers are being geolocated to?
Yeah, I think it's important to think about the bias of sampling, however that sampling happens, and what that means. I don't know much about anthropology, but from what I understand about, even dating samples in anthropology, like these are not exact scientists and exact sciences, and people argue about how we're even dating things as the oldest, and sometimes these have changed by thousands of years when somebody else has come with a different technique to kind of look at those samples. So I think that generally speaking, and I think I've said that already about kind of my area, is that the bias of the ideology that goes before sometimes can dictate the question that you ask and the samples that you get and the interpretation that you make. And I'm pretty sure that probably would be the same in anthropology as well. That, people have that confirmation bias, right? That you're only looking for the thing that reinforces the idea that you already had.
Exactly.
So, I don't know about this in particular, but I would bet money on the fact that these are the same biases that we have across all different spheres of generating research and knowledge.
Exactly. If no one's looking for the genetic data in Africa, then no one's going to find it, essentially. So exactly. if you go by this idea of oldest available sample equals, then you're always going to get the answer that you're looking for. In the field of historical kind of like dating and mapping these haplotypes historically over periods of 10, 20, 30,000 years is literally impossible based on a single or even two or even a dozen samples. It doesn't prove anything, unless you're able to map the entire world's population for that period of time. You are doing what is at best very, very shady guesswork in terms of how it was represented. So that's one of the things and this is I think we spoke earlier about the way genetic information is being, I'm not going to say exploited, but misused quite a lot in this field, and people in the field of genetics wouldn't agree with some of the conclusions that are being drawn by many of these kind of historical anthropologists, would you say?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think that different disciplines would have a different way of thinking about the same data. And absolutely, we had an incident here in Cambridge where I think he was maybe an anthropologist or maybe a philosopher, was making particular genetic claims about genetic data that, the geneticists at Sanger were like, that's absolutely just not true. That's not how you interpret the data in that way. So absolutely, when you get people commandeering a particular science to answer their own questions, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing it in the right way.
Totally agree. That's amazing. Thank you very much. Sorry, two things. Andre, I'm going to allow you to shoot, but before you do, can we just unblock Africa Teacher, please? As annoying as you may find his comments, it doesn't constitute trolling to just kind of like disagree, even if you disagree with his disagreement. So please, whoever blocked him, just unblock him, please let him back if that's okay. Thank you very much. And Andre, shoot.
Hi, King, Sasha.
Hi.
Hi, how you doing? So yes, I have a question about a 2013 study that I actually ran across, and it really caught my eye. So this is actually from the National Library of Medicine. And basically what it's saying is that it says an African American paternal lineage adds an extremely ancient root to the human Y chromosome phylogenetic tree.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm looking at it, I mean, basically like what is the abstract pretty much is saying, like it says that they reported discovery of an African-American Y chromosome that carries the ancestral state of all S and Ps that define the basal portion of the Y chromosome phylogenetic tree.
Okay.
So basically what they're also saying is that it's not necessarily found like in Central Africa. And then they also said something about it not being found in like hunter-gatherer populations in sub-Saharan Africa.
Sure.
And I'm trying to figure out like what does that mean? You know what I'm saying? Because I did like a chat GPT on it and stuff like that. And basically what it's saying is that like, when they say that, it says a person's Y chromosome has the most ancient form of genetic variation at the base of the Y chromosome family tree. And it said it indicates a lineage very close to the most recent common ancestor of all modern humans on the male line. Essentially, their Y chromosome carries the oldest identifiable genetic markers on the Y chromosome lineage. And I just wanted to get your opinion on that.
Okay. So
I know that was a lot. I'm sorry.
It's fine.
And before you answer as well, we are going to hard close at 11 o'clock because I feel like your mouth must be dry now.
You've done everything. I didn't even know what I look like anymore.
Hard close at 11. Go on.
So I think possibly part of your question was just like, what does that actually mean? Like, so what do they mean when they found a Y chromosome haplotype that harks back to the most recent ancestor of the oldest ancestor, that type of bit of the question. So I guess that's just a description of, so I think we spoke about this before, this phylogenetic tree is basically like this descendant tree for the entire human population. And we have this single kind of ancestor, male ancestor at the top of it. And then all populations branch off in these different ways to all of the different populations around the world. And so your haplotype is basically your branch to this link to the oldest ancestor. Everybody going back would eventually get back here. And your haplotype, the haplotype that they're talking about, is the split that was the most recent split from this common ancestor. And they found one in this group of people. So I think that was the first bit of the question.
Right.
And then was there another bit of the question where you were asking about why it wasn't linked to Central Africa and hunter-gatherers?
Exactly. Why wasn't it?
Yeah. Why would you expect it to be? Is that?
Well, I mean, we've been told that we, came from the slave trade, stuff like that. We descend, and basically our ancestors are in Africa and whatnot. And from there, basically, I feel like, if that's the case, then I honestly feel like it should trace back there, right?
Yeah. Okay. So going back to this diagram, I guess. That Y haplotype is only telling you about one line to your recent ancestor. Okay. And because we are, as descendants of lots of migration and a transatlantic disruption called the slave trade, there is lots of mixture between these different haplotypes that we might have. So I would imagine that it would still be possible to look at a group. So it's not saying all African Americans have that haplotype. It's saying that they looked at a group of African Americans who have this haplotype and have introduced this haplotype into the understanding of the migration. So it might not be that one particular ancestor who was the Y haplotype in that group of people came from that part, but that doesn't discount all of those ancestors in the middle. Right. Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
Yeah. So the story could still be the same.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Amazing. All right. So I'm going to move on from you now. I'm going to ask Ultimate Chakra to ask your question, please. If you're there still.
Hello.
Right on time. I was about to remove you. Nice to meet you. How you doing?
What I wanted to say is 4.5 billion years. So I know that what won't be here in another 500 million. But I wanted to ask, how do you see that, from a Western perspective? They don't really give us. Can you not hear me?
You're breaking up really badly.
Can you not hear me?
Try. I'm going to remove you. Try rejoining, okay? Because you're breaking up really badly. I'm going to move on to Neuro Escuro. Could you ask your question, please?
Hello.
Neru, sorry, not Neuro. Sorry, it's late. Go on.
No worries. My question is, I see a lot, especially on Discord, people come up with these G25 results, and they're trying to make it seem like a certain population has this kind of ancestry and all that. I'm just wondering, because I've seen a lot of stuff, what are possible ways that people can misrepresent data on G25?
Do you know what G25 is, Sasha? Okay, I have a feeling I know what it is. I think basically there's this tool that people use, and correct me if I'm wrong, where they enter their uniparental lineages, only those, and then it chews them up and spits back your percentages of what your ancestry is. Is that the one where you only put in your Y DNA and mitochondrial DNA? Is it that one? That's a question for you, Neru. Yeah, I think it is, because people are making loads of pseudo and stupid things. So I know there's someone out there who created this tool basically where you just put in, and the only reason I found out about this is because they produced the ancestry for the two brothers from the 12th dynasty, ancient Egypt. I can't remember who they are, but someone produced their full ancestry, and I was like, I know that those guys were only tested for uniparental markers. They never published any autosomal DNA. So people are making full genome breakdowns based on uniparental markers, which is it's just stupid, isn't it? In my view, it's just stupid. Sasha, could you give some feedback there?
I've never heard of it, but if what you said is correct, then it doesn't feel like it's enough data to even make that statement. I don't know. I don't know it, so I can't talk on it.
I think it's the one. People are saying it's open source, but I think I know which tool it is, and I think it only uses uniparental markers, which is
okay.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense to me, and I'm not a geneticist, but I was like, how you can't give someone feedback on what their percentages.
Yeah, I mean, you can, but how? As I said, accurate is such a hard word to actually use in this context, because you make your own goalposts. So depending how they've decided to define ancestry and ethnic groups determines how well this test they have designed can answer that question. But I don't know enough about it to say what it does. Sorry.
No,
Brilliant.
okay.
Yeah, and I wish I could give you a better answer. I'm not that familiar either. I'm doing a big guess here, just based on something that I had seen before, and I have that's the one that seems to be going a bit viral. A lot of people are running their details through this, and I was just like, no, that's, at least from what I know, that's not how it's done. But
I'll have a look. It sounds interesting. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Neru. Africa Teacher, is that the same Africa Teacher? Is that you there?
That is me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear. How you doing?
I'm fine. I'll state two things. One, G25. G25 is a genetic analysis product created by an enthusiast that doesn't use uniparental markers, but rather it uses principal component analysis and creates coordinates. And based on those coordinates, you put your information in there, and then from that, it gives you a breakdown of supposed ancestry.
Principal component analysis, but using what as the source data?
Your raw data from 23andMe.
But does it use autosomal data? Okay.
Autosomal SNPs, definitely.
Okay.
And in regards to haplogroup R, someone thought I was trolling. And I think what we need to do is look at the phylogenetic tree of how we get to R, right? And so when you're looking at the out of Africa migration, supposedly, if anybody wants to bring up a phylogenetic tree, they can just bring up a Y-DNA tree, and you can see one on Wikipedia. You'll see out of Africa leaving out as CT. And from there, you have a mutation CF. Then you have FT. Then you have GHIJK, then you have HIJK, IJK, K, NR, and then you get to R. And so all the way down the line, you have all this uniparental diversity that is specific to Asia. So we're talking about haplogroup J, T, M, S, O, Q, R, dealing with Europeans, East Asians, South Asians, Southwest Asians, Caucasians with haplogroup G. All this diversity is outside of the African continent. And so for haplogroup R to have an origin in Africa, you're talking about like 40,000 years of mutations that are somehow absent Africa, but then boom, haplogroup R just appears on the continent. And so like the evidence doesn't support haplogroup R originating in Africa because there are so many other mutations very specific to Eurasia, dealing with South Asians, East Asians, Northeast Asians, Southwest Asians that are brother lineages and uncle lineages to haplogroup R that don't originate on the African continent.
But a phylogenetic tree isn't an exact science, right? Exactly. A phylogenetic tree is making the best guess about the order of mutations. So if R wasn't there and R came before those rather than after those, then it would be correct. So if somebody hadn't seen that string of mutations in the order of where you've described it, absolutely, they might put it at the end. But in my thinking, that can change because phylogenetic trees do change because people then reorder where they think that these patterns of mutations have happened. So that's just me talking generally about a phylogenetic tree, like it's a hard and fast piece of information. It changes.
You're absolutely correct. And the beauty of that is when they resolved haplogroup R, the resolution made it even deeper embedded into Southeast Asian diversity. So the later studies, you'll see haplogroup R, typical of Europeans, coming all the way from Southeast Asia. And there's all these other mutations like haplogroup S dealing with Poppins and haplogroup M in Oceania and O in East Asia that are related to R. And they're all nested into a superclade of K2B2.
So can I ask you a question?
Go ahead.
do any of these haplotubes, that's my new word, haplotubes. Do any of these haplotypes exist on the African continent? Do people carry them on the African continent?
Some of them, like haplogroup J, which is
so you're saying there's literally a hard line and no one on the African continent carries like some of the other ones you've mentioned? No one. You can't find a single person.
No one carries probably N and Q. Well, you even have some people with Q because of the Mongols and stuff. But like S and clades typical of Southeast Asia and Oceania and Papua New Guinea, no, Africans do not have those clades.
Okay, so I'm not talking about S, but speaking about the ones that led up to R, your argument is that none of these can be found on the African continent at any frequency.
Most of them, no.
I think you're incorrect.
You have to look at how deep R is.
I think I'm going to stop you there because I think you're incorrect on that. Because the idea of these hard lines when it comes to these haplotype markers, yes, you do get some isolated populations, but they are very few and far between. Very, very few and far between. Any populations that had any kind of like integral part in, civilization, or even not even civilization, just peopling around Europe and Asia, those haplotypes are almost guaranteed to be found on the African continent.
They are.
So they're going to be found. The issue is let me explain quickly. The issue is that they're going to be found at lower frequencies. And the reason that they're going to be found at much lower frequencies in Africa than they are in Asia or Europe is because of African phenotypic diversity. Because you have so much diversity in the African continent, it's very difficult, almost impossible to find any individual haplotype occurring at high frequencies. That's why you only find little pockets and little groupings of people carrying them. You won't find it you won't get a 98% coverage like you do in Ireland and R1b. That's impossible.
That's untrue. Actually, there's one group, the Oldume.
Exactly, that's what I was saying. A group. A small group, not isolated.
Small, isolated. But I think
But that's my point. So the point that I'm making there is that you've chosen to take a certain or to accept a certain interpretation of how that has evolved, for want of a better word. I'm not a geneticist, on the European or Eurasian landmass, and take that as being the correct interpretation. But it's not the only interpretation. You're taking a phylogenetic tree and taking that to be gospel. But what is being explained is that those phylogenetic trees can change. And actually, if you listen to what I said earlier, much of the conclusions that are being made in regards to the data that you're interpreting is based on what has been sampled. That's the only way they can come to these conclusions. They have to carry out sampling first. And when it comes to sampling of old genetic material, not current populations, because often they can't tell you very much, old genetic material, you're going to have a massive bias in cold climates where there's been preservation, as opposed to Africa, where they're not even testing, and then compound that with the fact that you're going to have poor preservation of samples. So it's just you're taking a seemingly logical approach to how these markers occurred, but I disagree. And it's not based on feelings. It's a bit disagreement based on
I'll
logic.
say this. My analysis comes from studying this data for about 20 years. Excellent. So a lot of people haven't been studying it 20 years. So the genetic studies and uniparental studies that were released in the early 2000s, I read that stuff in real time. And I've seen the changes over the past 20 years. And I remember when we were looking at haplogroup R and thinking it originated in Africa. But as they do more research and as these trees are more refined, it is very clear. And I mean, the watcher should really see the latest phylogenetic tree to see how deeply nested haplogroup R is, it's a young clade as well. So it's not like it's an old clade that originated 50,000 years ago and has just been isolated in Africa. No, it's actually fairly young.
Can I just say something in regards to R? That where it's in Gonzalez's study, the one that I mentioned, one of the things that is unresolved is the fact that the population that carries that haplotype do not carry other genes that they would carry if there was some kind of backflow or admixture migration.
Right.
So migration or admixture, they don't carry it. That's unresolved. That fact is unresolved. So even you could carry on from there, but you have to resolve that fact first of all.
It's okay. You have to look at a tree. Gonzalez 2015, I mean, that's 10 years ago. It
doesn't matter.
Well, at that time, haplogroup R was a standalone clade, and it wasn't resolved into a minor subclade of a Southeast Asian one. So when you look at haplogroup K, which is widespread in Southeast Asia, and all that diversity, and you see haplogroup R is a subclade of a subclade of a subclade of a subclade of K.
But K is all over Africa.
Ancestral clades are not all over Africa. Brother clades to K are not all over Africa.
Okay, this is
clades of K are not all over Africa.
What we'll do, Africa teacher, I'm very happy to let you come into the Discord, because this is probably really boring for people who sit outside of this world. And to be honest with you, I'm not gonna sell myself as someone. I'm someone who I'm very much a genetic skeptic. So this is the perspective that I'm coming from. And I think you know that from most of the streams that I do. I don't put massive amounts of weight in terms of loads of the conclusions that are being made. So me going back and forth with you, you probably know more about me than a lot of these things. Feel free to join Discord. Let's continue this conversation. I want to give other people a chance to join, to ask the question before I let Sasha go, because she looks really tired. Is that okay? Yeah.
Hey, listen, you told me there was a hard stop at 11.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm just going to give London MMC a chance to ask his question, and then we are gonna hard stop.
Okay. And also, there were no sisters, so.
What's going on there? What's going on there? Sorry, Sasha. Thank you again. Go ahead, London MMC.
All right. Well, first of all, you guys are doing great. You guys are awesome. Thank you very much. So unfortunately, I haven't really had time to formulate this question the way I'd like to. So sorry if it's kind of messy, but let me just preface this by saying that I'm a proud African American man, because this line of questioning, usually people kind of take it one of two ways. It gets kind of weird. But lately I've found, by doing like a lot of family tree research, a lot of Indian heritage in my family. But of course, these were like dark-skinned Indians, mainly on the south, like in the southeastern United States. These are Indians who, of course, aren't going to be referenced in any kind of sample pools or genetic studies. However, a site like Ancestry does acknowledge that. But I'm wondering if, and I don't know if you're the right person to ask, I'm kind of late to this live. They acknowledge that, but obviously, they give you a full ethnicity estimate, 100% ethnicity. So are they, basically my question is, are they kind of fudging the numbers? Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I was kind of wondering if that's just what they just kind of make up the rest, or how does that work,
Yeah. So we had this discussion before. Is first of all, you have to decide on the groups that you want to include, and the groups that you want to include will be based on the reference data that you already have. And then you do the test, and you're using statistics to say that this person has a certain amount of DNA that's matched to other people who live in this particular place at this particular time. So that means that if there are samples that are not in the reference set, they can't place that. So they just either ignore that bit of sample or place you with somebody who's the closest. So for instance, they might say that you are related to, I don't know, perhaps just for argument's sake, like a particular part of somewhere in the south of America. But because that's not being well categorized, you don't have any granularity or any older information about the fact that those people might also share similarity with these South Asian populations that you're also related to. Like, it just won't appear in the test. And so the test isn't, as it looks, literally this carving up of you in terms of percentage wise. It's just saying that of the DNA that we looked at, this much of it matches this set of people. And so it will change over time. So it might be something that you want to wait some time to see if they actually do sample that place in the world, or maybe you want to research to see if there are other databases that have included that population and redo the test there, and you might get slightly different information. But the test is always a probability of things based on the groups that they've decided to use. So it's never, your DNA doesn't change, but actually the references that they use do.
Awesome. I'd love to ask you more, but we said we'd hard stop at 11, so hopefully you'll be on again, and I can bother you more. Yeah, I'll call in earlier next time.
Yeah, I need to get her back, so no one's asking any more questions. Yeah, I don't want to scare her off. Yeah, Sasha.
Yes.
I just want to read out 2 comments really quickly. Jonathan Waters, thank you very much for your $5. He said, send them to Discord. We have all those studies, and we do. So you're very welcome to come and continue the debate there. And another $5 donation from Lee Clinton, who said, haplotype is a construct like race, and kind of straight face. Now, I actually kind of agree with that personally.
Everything.
It's becoming very, people are defining themselves using these things now, which I find wild. And I'm XYZ. I'm like, what the heck? Is that a thing now? Yeah. So, Sasha, thank you.
Yes.
You have been everything that I expected and everything that I sold you to be. So, thank you so much for coming on. It was not, at least I wasn't disappointed. I'm not sure about everyone else, and I don't really care that much. I've had a great conversation. No, seriously, thank you so much. This has been absolutely epic. Guys on the call, would you agree?
Yes, this is awesome.
Yeah.
Very informative.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you. And you've really broken things down in a very, very easy to understand way. And thank you for the important work that you're doing in the entire, in the field. We need people like you who are just basically standing up for for us, for our history, for our presence, and for for our diversity. I said to you earlier really quickly that everyone needs a Rasta mum. I said I've got a mum and I've got a Rasta mum. Yeah, and my Rasta mum was the one that guided me. Yeah, she guided me on the ways, all things black. My mum obviously is a great mum, but my Rasta mum, everyone needs a Rasta mum. You are this channel's Rasta. You are this channel's Rasta mum now. Yeah, that's who you are.
No problem.
Thank you so much. Please, everyone, hit up the likes, leave a nice comment for Sasha, and I think at that point we're going to close the stream. Take care, everyone. Cheers. Thanks. All right.